Thank the organizers, my co-panelists, and everyone joining us today for being in conversation and for approaching these issues in this moment. I am a Menominee organizer, but I'm a city Indian, and my organizing is generally urban in nature. But in my work as a direct action trainer, I have been around the country, from Standing Rock to Boston and the Pacific Northwest, trying to deconsolidate some of the skills and knowledge that were gifted to me around different tactics, strategies, and principles of doing this work. Now, environmental work is not my primary focus. One of the traditions that this country did not manage to grind out of Native people when it murdered us, scattered us, and banned our religions was our sense of connection to the earth and our understanding that when you poison the water or when you eliminate any of the creatures that make up this reality, you are killing us too. Police, punishment and safety, and environmental and climate justices, I feel it's about time. And I want to begin with a quote, but given that her analysis really informs what I want to say about geography, which you can all read. What does that mean? It means prisons pay money to move, enforced inactivity of people locked in them. It means people extracted from communities and people returned to communities, enable the circulation of money on private sites. What's extracted sells. This opens up a hole in time, furthering, perhaps to our surprise, the annihilation of space by time. Let's breathe that in for a second. What is at stake today is what has always been at stake. Since our ancestors first resisted the horrors of capitalism, colonialism, chattel slavery, and the genocide of indigenous peoples on this continent and around the world. This apocalypse began in the 16th century. Collapse has been occurring since that time, but in ways that the majority did not view as a global crisis. For the sake of industry, for the sake of expansion, lakes were drained, dams were built, people and animals were poisoned, entire species wiped out, destabilizing ecosystems. This process was ongoing, and as people's capacity to build and reproduce goods and eviscerate land developed, the devastation escalated. I also want to be clear that at every step, indigenous people indigenous to this land have been clear about the stakes and have also offered insights on how to maintain and restore balance to ecosystems. Many of our cultural practices that would have helped keep the earth in balance were banned. Native people went to prison for the practice of cultures that honored our connection to the earth. So that is another important connection to understand. This society did not simply ignore what could have saved it. The very ways of living scientists are now screaming are essential to our salvation were criminalized for generations. When I talk about the violence committed against Native people, including carceral violence, we are talking about the violence of conquest and colonialism, which has evolved over time. This country's earliest military formations were created to annihilate Native populations and seize Native land. Now the military is a global force, doing things in Africa that most people have never heard about. But to this day, military personnel use the phrase in country to describe being in countries where the US military is engaged in active conflict. In country is short for Indian country. The US military is the world's largest single consumer of energy. Every year, the US military consumes more than 100 million barrels of oil. If the military were a country, its emissions would rank among the top 25% of nations. But with the military, we're not just talking about emissions. We're also talking about constant fuel leaks, contaminating water, the varying devastation of a whole array of weapons that annihilate both human beings and the natural world they inhabit. Rehearsals for warfare cause environmental havoc. The military also has a blanket exemption from all global climate agreements. In effect, it has a license to kill the natural world without consequence. Right now, many people are coming to grips with the reality that war is hell, because they are watching a war play out in Ukraine. But the hell-making of our own military is ongoing, because it happens second by second over the course of decades and is obscured from public view. Whether we are talking about white phosphorus the US deployed in Iraq, or marine mammals dying due to sonar testing, or the poisoning of water that landed 5,000 people in the Yar in Hawaii last year, war games, and the positioning of military resources are incompatible with human freedom and life on Earth. So why am I talking so much about the military? Because everything we experience in this country hinges on the legitimation of military violence and security as the primary purpose and function of governance. If those legitimacies are appropriately undermined, as we saw in 2020 with the police, political weather the ship suddenly and with great extremity. That is the task before us. Now, I began with Ruthie's quote on time because now we are in the end game of this apocalyptic process, and the theft of time from the larger populace is becoming more evident. We know that time is extracted from imprisoned people. We know that people who are defending the earth are being criminalized and hyper-criminalized with extreme charges. As recognition of the crisis grows, the stakes go up on all sides. As the pandemic has cruelly reinforced, capitalism will cut losses to maintain itself. Mass death in plain sight is the new normal. Climate denial is giving way to climate security. Rather than denying that we are living in an era of catastrophe and collapse, our enemies are leveraging the crisis as an excuse to box people out. In some ways, I feel as though we are living in a collapsing box, as borders and the extraction of time redraw boundaries of habitability and survival, where more and more people find themselves zoned into death worlds and sacrifice zones. But we must understand that under capitalism, on a long enough timeline, the entire world is a sacrifice zone. Bordering, partitioning, and extraction are the apocalypse. Prisons are the hyper-embodiment of these phenomena and of what they do to human bodies, as well as the natural world. The fight against prisons and the system that necessitates them is a fight for the future.
So well said, Kelly. Wow. So I came in, I'm Aline, I'm a reporter. I came into this work in part out of reporting on the criminalization of land and water defense movements. This year, I published a project that looked at the climate crisis inside detention facilities. So looking at where that criminalization leads. For The Intercept with my collaborator Akil Harris, we mapped the locations of more than 6,500 jails, prisons, ICE detention facilities, juvenile detention facilities against wildfire risk, heat risk, and flood risk. And what we found was that a lot of facilities are facing a lot of risk. A lot of places are already sites of kind of horrific climate impacts, and things are going to get much worse. So we found that more than a third of the detention facilities in the US have historically had more than 50 days a year, have been in counties that have had more than 50 days a year on average with a heat index over 90 degrees. By the end of the century, if massive steps aren't taken to combat the climate crisis, that will go to nearly 3/4 of US carceral institutions. Right now, no carceral institution in the US is located in a county with more than 50 days a year at 105-degree heat index. By 2100, almost 700 facilities will be in that condition, mostly in Texas, Florida, and Louisiana. We identified more than 600 facilities that have major to extreme flood risk. We found that about a fifth of California's institutions are above the 95th percentile for wildfire risk in the nation. But we also found that Florida has more state-run facilities facing extreme wildfire risk than California. So this is not something that's just on the West Coast, and that risk is going to increase significantly everywhere. We also spoke to a number of people who are or were incarcerated in horrific conditions or who have loved ones impacted by all of this. We spoke to people who spent more than a month this summer at the California Correctional Center, locked in dark, smoky cells because wildfires had taken down power lines in the area. And the generator for one unit was not working, leaving them without lights or fully functioning ventilation as the surrounding community was preparing to evacuate. Zero information about any evacuation plans were provided even to members of the Inmate Advisory Council, which meets regularly with prison staff. People were really terrified and their health was very impacted. In Texas, we told the story of Justin Phillips, whose kidney condition deteriorated as he sat in a building with no air conditioning as the heat index outside rose to 127 degrees, or according to the Corrections Department's own records. His wife, Casey's fight for her husband's life led her to start Texas Prisons Air Conditioning Advocates, which the predecessor to Texas Prisons Community Advocates, which is fighting for legislation mandating air conditioning in Texas prisons. As of 2020, only about a third of prisons in the state are fully air conditioned. So that's 70 facilities without full AC, 20 with none. I also spoke to Angel Argueta Anariba, who came to the US escaping Hurricane Mitch in 1998 until he was caught up in the criminal legal system a decade later. After serving a sentence for a crime he attributes to self-defense, he sat in ICE detention for over 7 years. There, he experienced dire conditions at the Catahoula Correctional Center in Louisiana during Hurricane Laura in 2020, which was followed by 2 other storms that same fall. Power failed for 5 days. He and the other people in the facility were left in the dark with no air conditioning, with heat around 100 degrees, he estimates. With the toilets not working, people were forced to defecate on trays that lunch had been served on, which ended up in the trash that guards did not remove for days. He said the smell was excruciating, it made him feel sick, it aggravated his asthma, which was made worse when pepper spray was repeatedly used to, I guess, control evacuees from other facilities in other parts of the facility. So Angel won his bond hearing this Tuesday, and this weekend he is with his family after being in prison, then ICE detention for more than 14 years. So I just want to take a minute to be really happy for Angel, who never stopped fighting for himself. He has just insisted on telling his story and demanding his rights for all that time. So it's his work that got him out of there. So while most people in places threatened by these risks can rely on mobility for relief, they can evacuate, get in their car, get out of there. People who are imprisoned don't have any control over their movement. They're totally at the mercy of the state to meet all of their needs. Our data told a story, but it didn't tell the whole story. We noticed that many jails and prisons were built, so many jails and prisons were built as the war on drugs was ramping up in the 80s and 90s. Those facilities are deteriorating, just as the climate crisis is deepening. So we're at a turning point where policymakers can either pour millions of dollars into the mass incarceration system to meet the constitutional rights of the people under their watch, or they can consider letting people out and coming up with different ways to think about accountability. Many of the facilities that we noticed with a history of flooding actually did not have high flood risk. If your facility is located high on a hill, it doesn't matter, but its roof is leaking and the infrastructure is falling apart, you're still gonna have flooding. So we're really at a crossroads, and I think it's up to movements like that are represented here today to help decide what happens next.
Thank you for all of that. Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Tamisha Torres Walker, and co-founder, executive director of Safe Return Project. Here from California on very little hours worth of sleep. Richmond, California, to be exact. And so I'm just really appreciative to be here. How did I come into this work? I am a formerly incarcerated convicted person. I am the mother of 2 sons who exist in dark bodies who deserve a world where they could be free, uninhibited by systems that cause them harm. And I, as a formerly incarcerated convicted person, I have been organizing in my community for about 10 years. But when folks say, like, I've been impacted by jails, prisons, and pollution my whole life. And so growing up in Richmond, Contra Costa County, where we have at least a state prison and federal facility, youth jails and prisons and jails 45 minutes to 15 minutes away from each other. And then we live along the Bay and the Delta, where we call it Refinery Row, where our water, soil, and air is constantly polluted. And Chevron, one of our major polluters, pours millions of dollars into our politics each year to maintain power. And that's been happening for as long as I can remember. So I've been in the work around decarceration, justice, reinvestment, and mass liberation for 10 years. I've only been involved in the work around environmental justice and mass liberation for about 5 years. And it happened as a result of being invited to a Just Transition Framework meeting, where I was the only formerly incarcerated person in the room, and everybody else was climate organizers. And they were talking about the just transition from extractive economies, the extraction of natural resources from our communities and from the earth, and how, we need to preserve, our communities for the next generation to come, with no conversation around the criminal legal system, or even the carceral state as an extractive economy in itself, and that it extracts whole people for profit out of our communities. And then in those institutions, our folks are totally neglected, just by way of lack of healthy food options and everything. I talked to a lot of people who are close to me, and just like a friend of mine was in a prison where they experienced valley fever, and I didn't know what that was. And so I'm like, so you take them from your community where investments could happen by way of justice for investment to jobs, healthy food, quality education, etc., and put in a situation where you could contract a disease and possibly die, where you could have been healthy in your community. And so we started to have a conversation around how do we work with these groups and other groups in our local community to start to shape narratives around just transition that could bring us together, and understand that I'm not only an individual that's impacted by incarceration, but also environmental injustices as well. And so it's really just been a journey to not just think about intersectionality. And the reason why I'm saying this is because a lot of the questions around how do police, prisons, environmental justice, climate justice, how do we address the intersections? And my experience, just even in my 10 years of organizing, even around crimmigration, which is the intersection between the criminal legal system and immigration, is that intersectionality is a popular word that we like to use. And we say it because we operate at the peripheral of movement rather than actually working together. And so when we say, what is the intersection between these movements, do we actually mean how we're gonna come together and fight? Or do we just mean how we work peripheral to one another? And as one community wins, another community loses. And we do not think about the impact of our work on, as the gentleman said earlier, our brothers and sisters as a whole. And I learned this because when we were organizing around immigration reform to end our local ICE contract, which we did, our sheriff was able to get $1.5 million that was supposed to go to reentry to keep people out of jails and prisons, to put more people in jails and prisons, because he lost his ICE contract. And so we celebrated for a moment, because now we have to figure out, how did we win and lose at the same time? And so most of what I've been trying to do in this space around just transition and mass liberation is to not just talk about the extractive systems, but also to talk about us and how we work together and how we operate within movement. And what are the narratives that we need to be discussing that are more transparent, transformative than what we've been using lately, because our enemy isn't larger than we are, but they continue to defeat us. And I have questions about how does that happen when there are more of us than there are of them.
Good morning. Is it on? All right. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm very honored to be on the stage at Beyond the Bars for the first time in many, many years. I've missed everybody. All right, so let me dive right in. And I think I'm picking up right where my sister left off. Thank you. All my sisters, actually. Thank you, thank you. Abolition is life in rehearsal. It is the unfolding totality of transitional goals, but they have to be designed for a totality rather than peripherally one to the other. As a principle and practice, abolition must be green. To be green, it's got to be red, and to be read, it must be international. So I'm just going to tell a story to illustrate this. You all know I'm a geographer. I came to that many years after organizing. I was a dropout for a very long time, and the book that Kelly mentioned, I started writing when I was a dropout, not when I was a fancy professor like I am today. All right. I am still a dropout, thank you for acknowledging that. About 22 years ago, a tiny group of abolitionists, and I mean 6 people, set out to stop a prison in California. And one of the waves of organizing they initiated for their campaign started at a tire fire that, while also in rural California, was not adjacent to the proposed prison site. Why? They combined their principles and their curiosity to put into motion life in rehearsal. In retrospect, we could say and do that we were following the lead of organizers whose work we might not yet have known. We were following the work of organizers whose work we might not yet have known. People like Michael Zinson, who was a member of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, a street fighter against the police, who, in the later years of his long career fighting for social justice, started doing work around environmental injustice and environmental racism because he saw a continuum from the organized violence that police laid onto the bodies of Black, brown, and poor people, and the organized violence of abandonment that produced death from asthma and other preventable causes. Or the Mothers of East Los Angeles, a group of Chicana and indigenous women who were prison fighters who stopped a prison in California in the early 1980s, who also asked themselves, why does the state think our kids are going to go to prison? And they realized one reason was their kids missed a lot of school, and they realized the reason their kids missed a lot of school was asthma, and the asthma that the kids suffered from was exacerbated by the fact that the housing project and community they lived in East LA was close to the freeways that were spewing forth diesel that affects or exacerbates restricted airway disease. So this vulnerability to premature death is cumulative, and it compounds many vulnerabilities, as we've heard from all of my co-panelists this morning. And as some young people in Central California summarized it for me many years ago, the problem is police prisons and pesticides, or police prisons and airborne toxins, whatever their source is, but particularly petroleum. Now, I can't read my own writing. As we know, climate change is propelled by fossil fuel, and I started our story with a tire fire. Now imagine a mountain of 5 million tires burning day and night. It is impossible to use a fire hose to put out a tire fire. The historical geography of the present is the historical geography of people fighting against these kinds of vulnerabilities to premature death. All those tires and all of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is resulted from the epochal shift to and dependence on petroleum-powered internal combustion engines, cars, trucks, buses, trains, ships. Most of the vehicles roll on rubber. A bit more than a century ago, Standard Oil, where the Rockefellers made their jillions, and the beginning of the USA as a creditor rather than debtor nation, petroleum-powered vehicles rose hand in hand then with, automobiles rose hand in hand with the US as a creditor nation, the rise of Standard Oil. And the automobile that was first among equals was the Ford. Henry Ford's production system standardized car making, lowering the price by learning from weapons manufacturers, particularly Winchester, the guns that were used to kill Native Americans across this continent. Henry learned how to make parts standardized and interchangeable from Winchester. The Ford Foundation, which opened in 1950, the year I was born, started out with the most astonishing wealth imaginable on the planet, and it was the wealth from this car manufacturing that obviously traces back through the history I have so briefly indicated. But those Ford cars needed rubber tires. Henry Firestone and his close-in elites tried very hard to figure out where they could grow the rubber trees to tap the rubber, to make the tires, to sell to Ford for his mass-produced cars to cover this land. And eventually, one of the concessions Firestone got was in Liberia. Liberia in West Africa, which was a settler colony to which the US Colonization Society deported American Africans who had been emancipated, thereby enabling them to have a modicum of freedom, but displacing indigenous people in Liberia in the process. In the 19th century, in fact, abolition had many expressions, and it was effectively captured as a police action reinforced by the British Imperial Navy, who patrolled the high seas and used spots in Liberia as well as Sierra Leone and so forth to place the captives from the ships they had interrupted, who then couldn't go home, but became, as it were, sojourners in yet another strange land. Land grabbing and water grabbing characterizes the establishment of concessions then and now, i.e. it's part of the colonial framework of the global racial capitalism. Agriculture, mining, forestry, all of these extractive land uses come together under this aegis. The rubber tree is from Brazil. In fact, it is a native of the Amazon, the lungs of the earth. And it is able to be grown in a rather narrow range of the Earth's surface, mostly in Southeast Asia, and we could talk about the various wars that have reconfigured Southeast Asia over the last century, but also in West Africa. Large-scale monocropping changes entire systems necessary for well-being, as Kelly was explaining earlier, and as our brother was explaining in the land acknowledgement. All of this activity is cumulative, and as Michael Zinson and the Mothers of East Los Angeles and that tiny group of abolitionists learned more recently, forces displacements by way of extraction and disappearance and waste. So the historical geography of the future is what we're working on. People organizing to put out that fire, did everything they could think of to gather evidence, promote their ideas, and change their fate, which is what, from the ground up, abolition or abolition democracy actually looks like. By rehearsing a different future, those comrades joined forces in this sticky, messy conjuncture where the residues of organized violence and organized abandonment condense and sometimes explode. So that community became part of the anti-prison movement, and the anti-prison movement became part of the anti-environmental racism movement, and all of those things became part of the anti-crimmigration movement. Rather than pretending that it's a military exercise, we show up as allies and then go home to our separate domains. The US military, as we know, has a policy. I think Kelly talked about it. They produce a good deal of global warming, and they are looking for climate refugees to make sure they cannot get to the United States. But organized people got rid of the fire and nearly stopped the prison that I talked about. The key is organization. Organization. If I have time later on, I will talk about some of the kinds of organizations that I see that have an international reach, that are refusing the capture of green by capitalism, that are refusing the demonization of red by capitalism, and are insisting that internationalism from below is how we're going to save ourselves. Thank you.
Thanks so much for all of those powerful insights. I think that what each of the speakers has made really clear is that the site of the prison itself is what makes some of these connections actually explicit, right? And if you go back to what the kind of circumstances that Aline was actually speaking to, it becomes so clear. Where I'm from in Chicago, I and some other folks who are here teach at a prison where there is an ongoing and continuing water crisis, right? And you know, as just recently, it was detected that there was Legionella bacteria in the water, so people were not able to drink the water, clean themselves with the water, brush their teeth with the water, and this became detected on a Friday. And so our folks were told inside, well, we can get you some fresh water on Monday. So no water over the weekend. And, you know, folks have been organizing mutual aid efforts to get water inside, but yet if they have no access to water over the weekend, they're still faced without any water. So I think that the site of the prison absolutely makes these kinds of connections explicit. But one of the things, Tanisha, I think that you said really struck me, that when you were going to the, well, many things that you said, but one of the things I wanted to ask you and others to speak to is, you noted that when you went to the just transition training, that you were the only formerly incarcerated person at the table. And I think that you also spoke to this question of sometimes when we win, we also lose, and how can we ensure that that doesn't happen? And I think we have to make sure that folks who are impacted by these struggles are actually at the table when we're organizing. Right, so if you could speak to, you know, how we can ensure, how we can lift up, how we can make sure that we're including currently and formerly incarcerated people in our efforts, and build up that leadership, that would be really great.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, some of the work, so one of the things for Safe Return, so our work is around policy advocacy, community-based research to find solutions to systems, and then justice reinvestment strategies. So when I was invited to this room and we're having these conversations, even like into this second year being at the table, my like climate and environmental justice folks still weren't getting it, right? And it was like, rather than trying to figure out like, okay, it was more like, hey, come to this soul to soul, or like what it became about is we felt like we were mission drifting rather than upholding the mission around mass liberation in that space. And so we had to step back and say, hey, we have GeoCorp that just opened up around the corner, and they're providing reentry services to prisoners while they're also the same corporation that runs private prisons. How does that happen in our own backyard? And it was very hard to get those folks to understand that while we also want to do a mobilization against Chevron, can we do a mobilization against Geo Corporation in our own backyard? And after a while, a couple people got it, and we did like a barbecue right in their parking lot, talking to people that's going in and out and educating the community. But it also became very clear that these spaces that we're all in, everyday folks are not. And the language we often use in movement spaces are not accessible to our everyday folks. And so it will make sense that I'm the only person at the table, because even the language being used in our movement spaces doesn't work on the ground in our communities. And so what I decided to do was, over the last 18 months, working with the Other and the Belonging Institute of UC Berkeley, is a research project to look at past movements, current movements, and how do we learn from how those movements came together, what was sustainable about them, what didn't work, and like, was there a formula? And if not, then is it really that we need to do narrative change to be able to defeat what we consider dominant narratives? But even that language isn't accessible to our people. And so I think for myself, the goal that I've had over the last 18 months is to create tools that we can use in community with language that's accessible so that we do come to the table. Because I'm not an academic, right? I'm not an academic, I'm not a scholar, I'm not any of those things. And sometimes, but I've been in these spaces long enough to be able to like interpret what's being said and communicate that out to my community. And so for us, that's what I've learned. The only way to be able to get my folks to the table, even if it's just locally at first, is that I have to make the language accessible, the spaces accessible, and also to recognize that although we're like fighting and organizing around environmental injustices and mass targeted incarceration of our folks, some people are still just trying to get a job, trying to have fresh water, trying to have a roof over their head, trying to make sure that their kids don't get arrested at school, trying to figure out where they're gonna have to find affordable daycare, because those are the everyday issues. And so my job is to show up and address those everyday issues while inserting that we can also organize in our struggle for mass liberation from these extractive systems. And so I think that's what's been the most challenging for me, but I think that's where people will get it, is when we actually make these movement spaces accessible. Because for the most part, for a lot of everyday folks, they are not. And so I think that's been my goal. Hopefully, enrichment with our Just Transition team, we have been incorporating more of that accessible language, bringing folks together, saying like, who is our common enemy? What is our common struggle? And then like, how do we work backwards from there to make sure that we're meeting the needs of everybody within movement while we're fighting for environmental change, as well as against the criminalization of our folks every day. And that's just simply what it is for me. I might write a book one day, but I'm gonna write a book one day with your help about how we make this all happen. But I think that's what it is for me. It's just making sure that I can get our folks to the table.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That really resonates with me, the piece about making the way we approach people more accessible, but also, I'll be real with folks, I spent the better part of my 20s strung out on heroin and doing crimes. So when I'm in a space and somebody comes in and acts in a way that offends or unsettles the room, I'm not getting precious in the way that some people are. Like, I'm not about to see something I haven't seen or hear something I haven't heard before. We need to be able to be uncomfortable, right? As folks who are welcoming new people into spaces or who are entering those people's spaces, right? And understand that we are not going to talk the same way, and that folks are going to maybe show up using language or, framing things in ways that make us uncomfortable sometimes. And getting used to that, I see as a huge impediment for a lot of the folks, the kind of folks you're talking about that are using the language that's not accessible to people. Like, folks in movement spaces need to understand that struggles are not sanctuaries. It's called struggle. It's not comfortable. Like, we have to be able to sit with our discomfort. And at the same time, we have to respect that we're human beings, so we need to process that. And so something that I really appreciated about the Project Mia's Abolitionist Institute that I led the direct action training piece at the past couple of years is at this year's Abolitionist Institute, every day at the end of the day-long sessions, there was a BIPOC processing space. And so all of the folks, the BIPOC folks got to stay after and talk about it. Like, how did things hit them that day? What felt right? What didn't feel right? And that, the organizers could use that knowledge to inform how best to move forward, how to do things the next year, right? If we are creating places for people to learn from each other about what we're feeling and what we're processing and what we're dealing with, then we're not gonna feel like we have to emotionally download in the workspace all the time, right? That's why we end up doing that. There aren't places in the world where we can be heard or where our voices are valued. So when we get into a space where actually we know that people at least kind of take this seriously, they kind of give a damn what happens to us. People seize upon that energy sometimes to insist everything must be right now. You must address me in the most respectful terms possible. We must use the right language to discuss the crisis. Everything in this space must be right. It's not about making a space where everything's right. It's about making a space where we can create constructive relationships and begin the process of learning from each other. Language is a grappling process. And I feel like there's this thing that's happened with a lot of folks where they feel like they've arrived at the right words. Like, everything up to now was a struggle to find the right words, and now we have them. And we get to yell at anyone who doesn't use the right words. Language has always been a grappling process. People pulling from history, from their own lives, from what they understand, from the way that language gets misused and then warped out of usefulness, right? We're constantly grappling. So if we understand our conversations with other human beings as a grappling process of trying to find the things between us that we actually want to exist and build those things, and not simply taking a red pen to each other all the time, or correcting each other, or trying to deposit the right ideas in another human being. I don't know anyone whose politics ever changed because someone walked up to them and said, "Your politics are shitty, use these instead." That's not how anything works. And I'll just close by saying that in my own real life experience of this, it's a matter of, I try to be adaptable. When my collective had to do a direct action training for a group that we knew had a lot of brown men, when we knew to expect some machismo, we talked in advance about, we're gonna have to navigate this, how are we gonna do it? We wanna hold our power and demand respect, but we don't wanna interrupt the work and prevent ourselves from training these people to build this blockade that they wanna build. And so after a long day of showing folks how to use power tools, showing them how we build things, how we deconstruct things, trying to establish we do know what we're doing, one of these guys yells out, "Where are the men?" And I have one of my trans sisters standing beside me and another sister standing beside me, and I can feel they're about to melt down. And so I just said, "At home, making me dinner." People laughed. We moved on. I established the line, They knew. I was saying, hey, no, actually, I hold power. You don't have to look around for the men. But I did it without derailing the work we were doing together. And we were able to move forward in a good spirit. And I think we need to find more ways to do that. And I think as a disabled person in particular, Like, I know what it is to expect accommodation and to know that people need to take into account that not everyone moves the same way and that sometimes we have unexpected needs. And so I try to deal with people nowadays in that same spirit in terms of what we're learning and how we're understanding each other.
Yeah, I want to build on what Kelly just said, and also, lift up abolitionist thinker Stevie Wilson, who is incarcerated, and kind of bring his voice into the room. Because I think when we talk about making our movement spaces more accessible, I think we also need to think about, how are we making our movement spaces, how are we building our movements with people inside as well. And I know one of the things Stevie says often whenever he has the opportunity to speak to audiences or write, is that if we're doing this work, you have to go and you have to be in communication with someone who is incarcerated. You have to go visit a prison. You have to actually see what that is like. So I just want to throw that into the mix as well as something that is really central and important to doing this work and making our spaces accessible, to be thinking about the people who can't actually be here physically with us today. So I want to move and ask Aline to talk a little bit, I think, about, you've been covering the crisis inside the prisons, right? Kelly and others have been really active in various mutual aid efforts, right? And I think I spoke about the kind of, collecting, thousands of bottles of water and bringing them into the prison. But I wanted to, for me, I think I grapple with this question because how do we hold the state accountable if we're doing the work and trying to meet the needs of folks, right? And so I'm wondering if you can talk about any examples, right, when you've covered different crises that hit prisons in different ways after disasters, and what are the ways in which the state maybe has been held accountable or has actually been forced to come in and address the needs of folks?
Yeah, so I think that has come from so many different directions. I think one of the most important starting points for what you're talking about is, I guess, organizers, reporters, attorneys, whoever, first listening to people who are incarcerated and taking the things that they're describing, the experiences they're having, the questions that they have seriously. So, there's a lot of gaslighting that happens by, these corrections departments and people inside of them as state officials. So I think first, believing people and starting by responding to the questions and concerns that people inside have has been really important for my work. In terms of examples of accountability, I've seen it come from a lot of different places. One of the starting points for this project that I described was the work of this group, Fight Toxic Prisons, which every year when there's hurricanes coming toward the Gulf Coast, they're identifying which facilities are in the hurricane's path and, calling those facilities, asking if they're going to evacuate, asking what the plan is, demanding evacuations, demanding a response. I've seen that in California as well with wildfires. In terms of the work of attorneys in Texas, the state has been forced to begin to take some steps toward protecting people from heat. They're far from sufficient, but they're, initial steps that are, making real differences in some people's lives. That has come because a number of people have died because of heat-related causes in Texas, and their families pursued lawsuits against the state and were able to find attorneys to represent them. I've spoken to, actually, I mentioned this family, Justin and Casey Phillips, who were dealing with Justin's kidney problem while he was incarcerated in the heat. They would love to go after the state. They cannot find an attorney to represent them. So, that kind of legal pathway has produced results in some cases. There's also these legislative pursuits, the same example in Texas, there's people pushing the state to install air conditioning in that case. In Florida, there's loved ones of incarcerated people that have organized to push for sentencing reform rather than, infrastructure adjustments. So that's another pathway that's happening there. One example that I brought into the reporting that I did on wildfires was this coalition in California called CURB, which includes critical resistance, which Ruthie helped start. So they, rather than, California has this huge backlog of repairs, which is impacting people in as wildfires come through. We talked about this generator problem. But rather than demand repairs, CURB is demanding the closure of 10 prisons, releasing 50,000 people in the next 5 years. They don't want the repairs. They don't want that investment. So, again, these are very different approaches to dealing with these issues. And I think, I think it comes back to listening to the people on the ground and what they want and need.
Thanks so much. We've been talking a lot about examples locally, and I'm hoping, Ruthie, that you can kind of help us step back and bring in an international lens and talk about some of the organizing and the organizations that are doing this work. I think you mentioned that earlier, and it would be great if you could do that.
Sure. I just would like to add a postscript. California's United for a Responsible Budget, CURB, was started by a group of organizations, Prison Moratorium Project, Critical Resistance, and one or two others. Prison Moratorium Project was inspired by a talk that the late, great Eddie Ellis, whose daughter is here today, in the mid-1990s, and he, as my partner Craig Gilmore, who's here, will attest to as well, Eddie's words blew our minds, and we never saw the world the same, even though we were already doing work. So that's the first thing. The second thing I want to say is, beware the trap of authenticity. It is not the case that if somebody has been locked up, they understand, and if they haven't been locked up, they don't understand. People have all different ways of coming to consciousness about reality, and there are people who are fighting for prison expansion who are locked up, as well as people who've never been locked up who are fighting for mass liberation. I've been to Yale, I've been to jail. I'm like in the Venn diagram. All right, but I needed to say Eddie Ellis. Presente. All right. In international work, there are many different dimensions of international work that we can see and understand the very exciting connections between and among. One has to do with, of all people, the nurses. I've been doing some work for the last few years with the biggest union of nurses in the United States, National Nurses United, which is part of a global network called Global Nurses United, who are connecting the urgency of caring for and protecting life at its most vulnerable, whether it's in the emergency, in a lockup, on the road of long-distance migration and detention centers and so forth. One thing that has gotten me really excited about what National Nurses United have done can be read about, actually, if you go to their website, if you have that capacity at your disposal, and see the resolutions that the nurses voted on at their last conference. They have voted against militarism. They have voted against the rise of police budgets. They have voted to support the kinds of things that abolitionists do, even though they wouldn't call themselves abolitionists. To me, it's the work that you do rather than the name you give it that matters. So that's an example. The reach of National Nurses United has taken me and others to what's happening in Brazil. The biggest Black country outside of the continent of Africa is Brazil, which has very murderous police, more murderous even than the United States, and the United States tends to be very high on the charts, where people are organizing in urban and rural communities to realize the fundamental conditions of life to have food, shelter, beauty, all of those things. So I'm thinking about what you said about, well, if the issue is daycare, then that's the abolitionist issue. The issue is not to say, all right, drop that and come over here and fight this jail. By working for daycare, the work against the jail proceeds. It's what the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense said. You know, survival pending revolution. Feed the people. And it's not charity, as Dean Spade reminds us, it's solidarity. So another example of such solidarity that I can see internationally is the landless workers movement in Brazil, MST. The landless workers movement in Brazil is, as the name suggests, a movement of people who are in rural parts of that vast country who do not have ownership or other kind of control of land, who have organized themselves over almost 40 years to seize land, to occupy it, what we call here in New York approvingly to squat on it, in order to make it fruitful for themselves and their communities. And the MST does this, establishing in the tradition of Maranhão and Afro-Indigenous solidarity, quilombos, where people establish villages, till fields, grow food, and they are now the biggest producer of organic rice in Latin America. That rice not only feeds people in rural and urban Brazil, again, remind you it's a big country, almost 300 million people, but some of that rice goes under the wall of embargo to feed people in Venezuela, which the US is starving, to feed people in Cuba, which the US has tried and failed to starve since 1959, and elsewhere. And because they have learned how to make the land fruitful through practice, through experiment and trying again, they, like so many revolutionaries of the 20th century, take their knowledge and ideas and ways of being in the world anywhere they're called. They will go to South Africa and work with communities in South Africa where people have built places to live because of really drastic housing shortages and worked with the communities to make the land fruitful. They go to Indonesia where people are trying to get rid of single crop earth destroying agriculture and make it more varied and fruitful, and so forth. That is what they do. Those are two examples, and I could go on and on with many more. But the point is here, organized people. We have to infiltrate organizations or organize our own. That is, Curb came from organizing our own. In other cases, it's infiltrate, it's one or the other. Because to go back to that example of the sheriff in Contra Costa County, the most organized people in the United States of America right now in the public sector are the cops. The cops are the most organized. When there is $1 available, they are first in line. They have their plan ready, and they hand it in, and they get the money. They've gotten all the COVID relief money in many, many, many places to build jails, to build prisons, and so forth. They're organized. We have to out-organize them. We have to out-organize them. Go ahead.
I just wanted to add to that, that one of the things that I find really inspiring about some of the work that Ruthie referred to in Brazil, the seizure of land, is the preparation that it takes to reclaim land. And I understood this just a little bit, having been involved in housing reclamation years ago, that you don't just walk up and steal a house, right? You have to put a lot of thought into it. But we're talking about folks finding surreptitious places to plant food all around an area where they want to take for like 6 months ahead of time, growing food and preparing in the periphery, because they know the soil that they're about to reclaim is not good, and it's going to take time to restore it and to be able to cultivate food that could sustain people, that could hold that land. So in the meantime, they are sowing seeds on the periphery and creating that potential for life and that potential to build. And that's something I'd like all of us to think about in the work that we're doing. That we don't just get to charge in and take over everything the way we sometimes feel compelled to, right? What seeds are we sowing? What are we nourishing? What are we creating that will sustain our movements when we retake land and try to make it good again? So just wanted to add that.
I wanted to thank you, and thank you all. One of the things that, like, early on in my organizing, which isn't much because I've been told I'm still a baby, is that an organized lie beats the disorganized truth, is what I've been told. And so when I think about that, is that for so long, even a lot of my community has been convinced that prisons, jails, and policing is what makes us safe. And so in a lot of ways, we've been lied to about these systems. And then even though we know that they don't make us safe, they don't provide for what we really need in our communities, in a lot of ways, our communities still invest because there's nothing else that folks can imagine that could keep them safe. And so a lot of what is not kind of like, I guess, revolutionary at this point is really having a conversations like there's national context around reimagining public safety. And almost none of that work talks about healing and like detaching ourselves from these ideals of safety that are our own. And so when you say like there's some of the most powerful unions policing and they're first in line for the money, is because in a lot of ways we aren't first in line, and it's because we still believe that they're here to make us safe in a lot of ways. And so I think having these conversations around, well, what we've been doing in our community, saying, well, what is public safety? Or not even public safety, but what makes you safe or feel safe? And then how do we invest in those? And even intergenerational conversations aren't happening in these movements where a lot of our elders don't feel safe in our community. And so a lot of what we've been doing is having conversations on like, when did we drop the ball? And I think that while having those conversations, also not taking full responsibility for what we know white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy created, that we still have to fight. One of the things that's been a challenge as I go back to narrative is like, even in Susanville, California, where they're saying they're gonna close a federal prison, the only thing that's offered is either the prison or death. So either the prison or the town dies. That's it. There's no offer that why can't a town thrive without a prison? Nobody is asking this question. It's either the prison and the town thrives or the prison and the town dies. Why are we asking what will it take for a community to thrive without a prison? That's the question that we are not asking ourselves. And when we get into California, and I hope my California folks still love me when I leave here, I think we practice restorative justice in California. Don't look at us as the example. for reform or progress. People not in California look to California. Almost all of our reform over the last 15 years has carved out violent offenders. I am a violent offender. I haven't benefited from one reform in the state of California. And it's because we continue to other even within policy, even within reform, is that there is this narrative around the deserving and the undeserving. And it is happening in our work in California, which is why a lot of us aren't gonna get free until we decide that everybody deserves to be free. The work around abolition, because I'm still trying to figure out what kind of abolitionist I am. But like people like, you're an abolitionist. I'm like, I'm trying to get there. Is that I'm like, yes, how do we imagine a just transition, a world without jails and prisons being necessary at all, military or policing, but also how are we working in community while those systems are still in place? Which is why we can fight for reform and to abolish jails and prisons, but also fight to make sure that the conditions in those jails and prisons are suitable for our brothers and sisters who are in those situations. Because what happens is when we solely focus on what happens when you come home and the idea of not having a jail or a prison, folks are dying from diseases, lack of having fresh water, food, air, all of these things, because if we allow the conditions to continue to get worse, then we're ignoring our folks on the inside in those conditions. And I know that the fear, right, because these are systems, is that the more that we ask them to invest in these systems, it's going to be harder to get rid of them. That might be possible, but why risk a life as a result that we could have saved if we fought for fresh water?
Would it be okay if I said a few additional words about California? I'm not disagreeing with you, but I want to lift something up because this is a golden moment to do it. Starting at least in the late 1990s, when the contemporary abolition movement got some legs, critical resistance, so on and so forth. So at least then, but that came out of years of organizing beforehand. So it's not something that was born in September of 1998, but it kind of congealed for the next round. The basics for abolitionist thinking refused carve-outs, refused the idea that anybody locked up should be sacrificed for some greater good in the future. We refused that. So Justice Now was formed. Legal Services for Prisoners with Children had been fighting. Dorsey Nunn was one of the organizers of critical resistance and also the organizer of All of Us or None, right? All of us or none, and so forth. We had these principles that we realized in everything we said and did. But as I said, we were a tiny group then, and the word rose, abolition, and spread, but the principles didn't necessarily travel with it. In the interim, something else happened. Now, I want to say something, I'm going to use some big words, and I'm just asking you to stick with me whether you like big words or not. Everybody likes some big words, everybody does. Philanthropy is private allocation of stolen social wage.
Yes. Yes.
That's what it is. So the Ford Foundation didn't pay taxes, established itself in 1950, the year I was born. That's wages stolen from all the workers who made all the cars that made Ford rich. Stolen directly by not paying them the wages, and indirectly by not putting that money into taxes that would be spread among all of us. That's what I mean. Philanthropy, I, the Ford Foundation, I, Rockefeller, I, Soros, decide privately how to spend this money that should belong to all of us in the first place. All right, so that's something. But it's also true that I do believe we should take the money and run. If you can get some, do it. But here's the in-between that's very important in this moment to me. So again, I'm not disagreeing with my sister. I hope I'm agreeing emphatically. Many philanthropists are themselves program officers, maybe some in this room, who have a portfolio, who are trying to bring about something. It's never revolution, ever. But they're trying to bring about something, some kind of social justice. I had a Ford Fellowship to write my dissertation. I had a Soros Fellowship to write my first book. The center that I run at the City University of New York was initially funded by Ford. They didn't ever tell me what to do or what to say, but they took the bet that somehow I would become a nice left liberal Negro who would want to promote the Democratic Party. Seriously. That's what my future was supposed to be, was to be part of the professional managerial class. That's what I was supposed to become. All right? So philanthropists and the program officers who drift between and among these various foundations put together the groups of funding with the eye of realizing the outcome that will make the world safe for capitalism, but a little bit less unjust. And it's certainly the case that in California, in spite of the more radical demands that abolitionists and abolitionist organizations made, that foundations came in and deflected that and threw money into organizations that would support and amplify the idea that reform requires carve-outs, that reform should not be universal, that there is no universal, or that, to use Connie Rice's words, the founder of the Advancement Project, that we should love the police because politicians are afraid of them. This is the world we live in. So take the money and run, but remember that in the context of all of these struggles, including in the National Nurses United, there are people who have antagonistically different views, and the question is for all of us whether the energy that is going toward abolition and toward mass liberation is something that we can incite and extend rather than us giving up before the fact and believing, as many people here in the city of New York have come to believe, guided by the Ford Foundation, that the only way to close Rikers is to build new jails.
Yep. Eileen, did you want to jump in here?
I mean, I'm just so grateful for this conversation because you guys are speaking to so many questions that came up for me as I was reporting this project. And I don't have a ton to add. I just wanted to say some of the things that Tamisha has said about winning and losing at the same time. You know, in Louisiana, where this guy Angel was in ICE detention, something like that played out. You know, there was criminal legal system reform and fewer people being incarcerated in these local jails, but the community needed more. these communities didn't have an alternative or didn't see an alternative, so they turned to ICE detention to meet their budget needs. And suddenly, in around 2018, Louisiana became this like center of ICE detention in the US. It also happens to be a state that is distinctly vulnerable to climate-related problems. So yeah, all these things overlap, and I'm just really grateful for this conversation.
I wanted to quickly ask folks something. Who here has heard of the Red Hill Fuel Storage Facility and the campaign around it? Okay, I see a couple of hands up in a really big room of people who give a damn about justice and climate. So I want to name to you all that a group of folks recently won what was believed to be an unwinnable battle in Hawaii. A coalition of folks beat the US military and forced the shutdown of the Red Hill bulk fuel storage facility, which was leaking fuel and destroying local aquifers. So the US military said that national security, we can't close this site. That's usually the end of every conversation. But 5,000 people wound up in the emergency room, and indigenous organizers got together with the affected families. The affected families were mostly military families. This was not a natural alliance. The Hawaiian Islands are some of the most heavily militarized islands in the world. Indigenous people there are very resentful of the military presence. And yet, folks found common ground, common cause, built relationships, and in a 4-month pressure campaign did something that virtually everyone thought was impossible. So I all want us to take away from that it is possible, that we can come together with people that we didn't think we could work with, who we would never otherwise want to spend time with maybe, and do amazing things. And also that we didn't know, that the people in this room did not know about that victory, from which there's so much to learn. So I hope folks, when you leave here today and you look up a lot of the great things people are talking about, I hope you'll look up the Oahu water protectors and the struggle to close Red Hill and take away what you can from what those folks accomplished. We did an episode about it on movement memos. To be honest, most of the good coverage that is not through Truth Out, where I work, is local, because this story is just falling through the cracks. We can't allow that. When the military gave a press conference to announce this historic concession, all the follow-up questions were about Ukraine. We cannot allow this. So amplifying these stories, amplifying when people do work together and work against the security state successfully, that is part of our work too. And I also want to name that Truth Out, my employer, an independent journalism publication, is in great danger right now. It's an abolitionist publication that's been able to survive the decimation of independent news, but algorithms are killing our fundraising right now. And that's intentional. Facebook and Google have targeted independent media for destruction, and it's working. So I just want us to remember the importance of storytelling and of uplifting the stories of people who win, and to remember that we need to keep creating platforms to do that and to keep platforms alive to do that.
I'm so glad that Tanisha raised this issue of carve-outs. And I don't think it's not just happening in California, it's in Illinois, and it's everywhere. And I think it really actually goes back to what Kelly started with, quoting Ruthie, the problem of innocence, right? I mean, that piece of Ruthie's, I mean, it's actually a hard read. It took me a long time to get through it. I finally had to digest it by reading it as if it were a poem. But it's beautiful writing, and it deals with really hard issues that you have to wrap your head around, because Tanisha talked about the dominant narrative, right? It's all around us. And I think Ruthie, in that article, in that piece, is really grappling with and challenging this dominant narrative, this question of innocence, like the question of carve-outs, who's deserving and who's not deserving. So I do want to urge everyone, buy Abolition Geography, but also just read the piece. You can find it online. It's part of another beautiful book, anthology. That's where I found it. The name escapes me right now. But I think grappling with these questions, these hard issues, is really what we're doing today and what's really been represented on this panel. Sadly, we do have to bring this session to a close, but so happy to be here with all of you. I'm thinking of Grace Lee Boggs right now, and how she said, you know, we're living in a time where we really need to grow our souls, and that's what I think we've been doing here with this conversation, and what I look forward to doing with all of you for the rest of the day. So thank you so much.
Okay, give it up one more time. I had a quick moment of crisis as they were doing the panel, because I thought, where's my pen? I can't take notes. They're saying the things that I need to write down again and again. You know, none of us will be free until we figure out that all of us deserve to be free. Like then I remembered, y'all, that we live stream, and all of these conversations will be archived on the Center for Justice website. So if you're like me and you had that moment of crisis about that note, that thing that got said, that you didn't get all of, it is on the website, so you'll be able to replay that. And while we're at it, hello to the people that are joining us online. We're happy to have you here too. So quick note, everybody, we're about to take a 5-minute break, and that's a real 5-minute break. So we're gonna start again with our next panel, whether you're here in the room or not. So 5 minutes, y'all. We'll do the second panel, and we'll see you here really soon.
On the first floor. Did he go downstairs? Okay. But there's probably one person. Wait, you're gonna stay? You're gonna stay? Yeah. Your slide. Hi, nice to meet you. Oh, hi, nice to meet you. This is live streaming. Is it live streaming? This one I'm using
All right, everybody, I know that feels quick. But I promised that we would do 5 minutes. So we're going to get started. If you can start making your way back to your seats, we're going to bring up our next panel. Everybody start making your way back to your seats. We are going to get ready for our next panel. But before that, we're going to have a quick word from our good comrades at the Center for Justice. Right? So come on up, Karen. I know Cheryl is in the room, Geraldine. Y'all, these are my people. Come on now.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Time is flying. I'm trying to make sense of what time of the day it is. So glad you're all here. I think mainly I just want to offer my gratitude. It takes a lot of hands to put a conference together. Riverside Church, all the caterers, all of the organizers, all the speakers, all of you for deciding to spend Saturday with us. So I just really want to say thank you. I'm really glad you're here. I'm going to turn it over to Cheryl for a moment.
Hey, good people. I just want to add Jackie McLeod as well. She's a part of our Beyond the Bars movement, and she helped make this happen from Jersey. And just to show you her reach, and I appreciate you, and thank you for that. And it feels so good to be in person. Can we just say, yay! Beyond the Bar movement is back. So, this is our first time coming back in person. I'm so excited. My heart is beating fast because, this is our people, this is our family, this is our movement, and to see you all in person is just amazing. One of the things that we are going through is that our good colleague, friend, sister, Kathy is not here in person, but she's here in our spirit and in our heart. And we're going to hear something from her later. But right now, I just want to get the energy up. And on the count of 3, I want y'all to say BTB Kathy. 1, 2, 3. BTB, Kathy! BTB, Kathy! BTB, Kathy! We love you, Kathy. You're here in our spirit.
So this is just so extraordinary to be back in person after 2 years. The last event that many of us were at together was the Beyond the Bars 2 years ago. Kathy, Cheryl, and Cameron, and Jonda, they kept it going. Last year it wasn't in person, but we're back again. So you did an extraordinary job. So big round of applause again. And also, Kathy was overseeing everything. So nothing happened here without Kathy's inputs and enthusiasm and really, helping to ensure that her vision for what this conference has become continues today in our absence. Next year, of course, she'll be back in person. But I also sort of wanted to highlight the fact that some of the students that I talked about at Sing Sing, sometimes when I couldn't be here at the conference, that's where I was, are here today at a conference that they've known about, and also students home from Queensborough and from Taconic. So welcome to your first conference in person. I know you were tired listening to me talking about it, but congratulations to you too for all you're doing. And with this, we'll get off the stage.
We have one more quick thing. So we're going to have our next panel in just a moment. Like Cheryl said, Kathy cannot be here today in person, but she is watching somewhere on a computer. And we were fortunate to get a little message from her. So if you could play the video, please.
I want to welcome everybody to Beyond the Bars. My name is Kathy Modine, along with Cheryl Wilkins and Geraldine Downing. We co-founded the Center for Justice. And we're excited that this is our 12th annual Beyond the Bars. It seems like Beyond the Bars is a place where people can come together from around the country and talk about really complex issues that haven't been resolved, including the issues that relate to what struggles have in common and what they don't have in common. This year we're introducing a whole new struggle, which is the issue of climate change and its relationship to the struggles around mass incarceration. We're excited that you're here. We're excited to learn from the conversations that we all have together. And we are just, very, very happy to be able to host this Beyond the Bars again under different circumstances because of COVID. I couldn't be there today because of family issues, but I'm with you in spirit, in my heart, and I can't wait to watch it and be with you in person through Zoom.
BTB, Kathy! BTB, Kathy! BTB,
Kathy, we love you, Kathy, for real. I was listening to the first panel. I'll just say one thing. I was listening to the first panel, and I'm thinking about how hard it is to build things. And what Kathy and Cheryl and Geraldine and me as a lucky person have been able to build, I think is really beautiful. And we love Kathy. We miss her today. So if the next panel can come up, Nadia, Sumaya, Asha, and Darren. I'm just going to quickly introduce Nadia, and she's going to introduce everyone else. Nadia Ben Youssef is many things. She's the advocacy director at the Center for Constitutional Rights. She has a long history of movement, organizing, and advocacy work. And I think the one thing I'll add is that in terms of people who talk to me about the importance of organizing across issues and across movements and the power of solidarity, Nadia has been one of my biggest teachers. So thank you, and I hope the panel's great.
Awesome. Thanks, Cameron. What an honor to be here. I met Kathy in December of 2014 in Palestine. Kathy and Sheza were visiting, and the next year I came to my first Beyond the Bar conference, so it's an honor to be here and to be with all of you, and agree that it's emotional to be in person. We're talking about organizing at the intersections, and we're going to build on that incredible panel that we heard. And Tamisha, when you were speaking and you asked at the beginning of your opening remarks, like, how do we do this? How do we come together to fight? And you said, especially when we know we are the multitude. And so I want to start with a story, and then we're going to dive into the intersections with this extraordinary panel, which I love and has helped me understand how to make the empire tremble, which is what we do when we build at the intersection. And so it's a story that takes place in the Roman Empire. And it's a time in the Roman Empire where there's a massive influx, there's a kidnapping and a massive influx of enslaved people in Rome. And at the time in Rome, there are civility laws, meaning it's how you comport yourself on the street. So, for example, you can't strike a free person in Rome, but you could an enslaved person. There was chaos in the streets, and a senator comes to the Roman Senate and says, we have to deal with this. This is total chaos. And he has an idea and says, we should give the enslaved a distinctive dress so we know who is enslaved and who is free. And as the story goes, Seneca says that's a terrible idea. If we give the enslaved a distinctive dress, they will know how numerous they are. If we give the enslaved a distinctive dress, they will know how numerous they are. We are the multitude, as Tamisha said. We are the multitude, and when we build, when we recognize each other and each other's struggles, when we etch each other's struggles onto ourselves, and we move through the world knowing that we are the multitude, that is when we win. And that is when the empire trembles, and that's what we're going to talk about today with this awesome panel. I'm super excited to be with you all. We have Asha Rosa Ransbury-Sworn, a Chicago-based community organizer committed to growing big, bold movements that get us closer to being a little more free. She was a co-founder of BYP 100, and as a college student helped launch and led a campaign that successfully pressured Columbia University to financially divest over $10 million from the private prison industry. In 2014, Asha was a part of the We Charge Genocide youth delegation to the UN Convention Against Torture, where she testified on the issue of police violence in Chicago. Asha now sits on the steering committee for a citywide campaign to defund the Chicago Police Department and serves as co-director of organizing for Dissenters, an anti-militarist youth organization fighting global policing and war. Sumaya Awad is a Palestinian writer and organizer focusing on Palestine, Islamophobia, immigration, and labor. She is director of strategy at the Adala Justice Project and co-editor of Palestine, A Socialist Introduction. She's a member of NYC DSA. We're going to be joined on screen by Monica Trinidad, a queer Latinx visual artist and cultural strategist based in Chicago. She is the co-founder of For the People Artist Collective and a member of Just Seeds Artist Cooperative. For over a decade, Monica has created zines, digital graphics, mixed media posters, and other visual art, amplifying youth-led, intersectional, and grassroots abolitionist organizing in Chicago and nationally. And last but not least, Darren Mack, an activist, advocate, and organizer. Darren is a co-director at Freedom Agenda, a member-led organization dedicated to organizing people and communities directly impacted by incarceration to achieve decarceration and system transformation. Folks, this is an awesome panel, and these are organizers who we're going to learn from and think with. And I have a few questions, but I also want you to be thinking too. So we're going to talk about principles and strategies about organizing at the intersection. How do we win? So if you have questions that come up, we're going to leave some time at the end, like half an hour for your own questions too. So keep those in mind. And we're going to get started. I'm going to move into this space. And I'm going to start at the last panel because I think that that's a perfect way for us to get into this question of reflecting on the theme of this conference, and particularly in your own organizing. So it's the intersection, as we've been talking about, mass punishment, social control, domination, destruction of the planet, extraction and exploitation. So the question is, and Asha, I'll start with you, like how how do you see these issues as linked in your own organizing? And then we're going to move through deeper explorations about your work, thinking about the strategies and principles. So the first question is, how do you see these issues linked? This one?
Happy to be here. It's been a few years for me since I've been at Beyond the Bars. So I want to start to answer this question by talking about where I live and organize, Chicago, and then I'll zoom out a little bit from there. And I know I'm not the only Chicagoan in the room, so y'all know some of this stuff. Bear with me. So Chicago, right? Our police department gets 40% of our city's budget. That's $1.8 billion. It also houses the headquarters of the corporate headquarters for Boeing, which is the second largest profiter of weapons sales in the world. Boeing has gotten over $60 million in tax breaks from the city of Chicago since it moved there in 2003, or 2002, excuse me. All at the same time as throughout the course of, my life, communities, institutions, and programs that everyday people, particularly Black folks, have been divested from. So closures of mental health clinics, the 50 schools that were closed under our previous mayor, Ron Emanuel. And at the same time, as pathways have been paved for corporations like Boeing to profit from public dollars via tax breaks, and for privatization to happen of many of the different types of social services and programs that I believe should be public. And in this context, the city remains racially and economically segregated and deeply, deeply unequal. The role of the police in that, and the reason, why we see, layoffs, budget cuts, all of these things in every other area of kind of public goods except for police, is because, while we see Black neighborhoods specifically get utterly divested from and abandoned, it's in that historical and present context that people have problems, community violence, poverty, and police work to enact more violence, add to those problems, create new problems, and create the illusion that Black people and their behavior are to blame, instead of the decision makers controlling how resources get allocated, instead of the institutions and structures and corporations profiting from exploitation and abandonment and displacement. So policing works in Chicago, where I live, and do organizing to tell a story that focuses on crime, which is an invented category by policing, or violence, which individualizes things and obscures the focus away from structural divestment and inequality. So that's just a little bit about how I see things play out in my city. I think we can zoom out and see the very same practices, strategies, and experiences globally when we look at U.S. Border Patrol, ICE, the U.S. military. On a federal level, the military budget approaching $800 billion, $21 billion of that going to corporations like Boeing, who are profiting from and lobbying for more war making, more militarism. Those resources could fund a massive federal jobs program. Maybe jobs for people doing things like building clean energy infrastructure. Maybe jobs for people doing care work and providing real safety in communities, doing the things that communities need to thrive other than policing and militarism. And so I'm really interested in organizing campaigns and have engaged from my early days as a student at Columbia, doing divestment work to defund police campaigns in Chicago, to the work we do at dissenters, where we have young folks who are pressuring their college campuses to divest from weapons manufacturers and pressure cities to cut ties with corporations like Boeing. I'm really interested in organizing campaigns that look at how resources are allocated and distributed, how investments are made, and putting the fire to decision makers to answer the question of why. we didn't just get here, right? Decisions were made and for a reason, and there's an incentive there. And I think there's a lot of power in getting to that question of why, and looking at a budget, looking at what gets invested in and what doesn't, forces us to look at kind of the big picture of the different things that we're fighting for and against and how they connect. And I think it's important as I say this that the point in focusing on budgets or investment practices isn't just about money. It's not really even about money at all. It's about values and priorities in our society, and how resources get allocated is an expression of that. So what we see in those priorities when we look at the federal budget, when we look at the city of Chicago budget, we see that there's a prioritization of profit, a prioritization of advancing, neoliberal reforms that pave way for corporations to profit from and steal from, as Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore gave us, the framework and language to talk about stolen resources. Public money, public resources are actually resources that were stolen from all of us, and that we should get a say in where they go. And so anyway, that's a little bit about some of the organizing campaigns that I think are important, involved in work to reduce the Chicago Police Department budget and reinvest that in Black communities in Chicago. At dissenters, we have young people who are, as I said, working to get their colleges and universities to divest from weapons manufacturers, and are making progress in doing so. Students at University of Houston just had a win getting their student government to vote to divest from the war industry. Loyola dissenters in Chicago had a similar victory getting their student government to vote around supporting divestment from war making, and our Going Arms Genocide campaign that is resisting the city funds that Boeing is getting. In Chicago just had a win of the first in those 20 years that Boeing has been in Chicago, after pressure from our campaign, isn't filing for that tax reimbursement because they know that there is fire and heat coming, and we're going to continue to organize and pressure them in that way. And so, yeah, we see, policing and militarism and the funding and resourcing of it, as opposed to in the things that we need, as using violence, the threat of violence, creating and maintaining crises, and maintaining borders as what kind of lays the groundwork for the exploitation and extraction that capitalism feeds on and requires, and is being prioritized in our society. So that's just a little bit. Thank you.
Thanks, Nadia, for the introduction. It's really great to be here. I don't really know where to start because I feel like so much of what Asha said just can be taken and applied directly to Palestine and what has been happening in Palestine for over a century now. When you look at Israel's project of occupation and settler colonialism, land theft, expropriation, it's all based on, it all necessitates complete climate destruction and desecration. It's not a coincidence that what Israel has done to Palestine and what it's doing to Palestinians has also led to the fragmentation of the land, the physical destruction and desecration of the land, the uprooting of hundreds of thousands of olive trees, turning the Mediterranean, this pristine body of water, into a border, into a militarized border that could represent so many things, and instead just represents incarceration and imprisonment for millions and millions of Palestinians. It's a death trap. This beautiful body of water is a death trap, thanks to the Israeli military. And that all of this is by design, right? Like, these are all choices, like Asha was saying, Israel is choosing every single day for the last 100 years, and that are directly tied to militarism globally, to the arms industry, to the US government, and how it is profiting off of Israeli apartheid, right? Directly profiting off of In the material sense, right, the $3.8 billion that Israel sends to, the US sends to Israel every year, a portion of that money is used on weapons created here in the US from corporations like Boeing, right? So Boeing supplies actually most of the bombs that fall on Gaza. The technology they use, the precision technology they use is from Boeing directly. Or settlements that are sprinkled throughout the occupied West Bank, fragmenting Palestinian land and identity. That technology is also used on the US-Mexico border. And so it's these parallels that are so much more than just symbolic. I think we often talk about the symbolism between our struggles, and of course there is so much symbolism, of course there is. There's always so much symbolism between different oppressed groups and the struggles that they're going through, but then there are all of these material connections, organic material connections that also tie us together, and that by design are often underplayed and sort of shoved under the rug by our oppressors while they continue to work together. I mean, they don't have borders. Israel and the US, the governments, the people creating these programs, the people creating the surveillance we all go through, they act and have money going between them and different trade deals as though there were no borders. It's only us, the oppressed, that are forced to navigate these intricate and, by design, very complicated but simultaneously vague systems that keep us apart. And I think one thing in particular that I want to point out that I was thinking about the theme of this conference is also immigration and the idea of identity and how we're all forced to choose a group and I'd be identified under that, and that restricts how we interact with the world, how we interact with society, whether it's here in New York City and what kind of ID you have to get around, or in Israel and in Palestine, the Israeli ID system that fragments Palestinians so that if you're a Palestinian in Gaza, you could be walking distance from your now occupied home and you can't reach it. You can see it with your own eyes, you can see it with binoculars, you could walk to it, but you can't access it because it's now for a Jewish Israeli only. This idea of supremacy that sort of reigns, Jewish supremacy in Israel, white supremacy here in the US and in other places, and then how class fits into all of this. Who is profiting off of all of these systems of oppression? It's often the same people, it's the same corporations. Meanwhile, we are just increasingly fragmented and pitted against one another. There's so much more I want to say, but I'm also cautious of the time. I think one thing I wanted to mention specifically about the climate incarceration in Palestine is that even when Israeli soldiers marched into the occupied West Bank in 1967, when they took over the occupied West Bank and began the military occupation, there are documents that were found in the Israeli archives that showed how soldiers marveled at the beauty of the land and how Palestinian farmers had taken care of it. The terraced farms, the way that water was used from these natural aquifers all throughout the occupied West Bank, and they marveled at how incredible and efficient it was. And then they proceeded to completely destroy it and build these Jewish-only settlements that do the exact opposite to the land. They completely desecrate the land. They bring in invasive species from abroad. They've destroyed the water aquifers and instead created these enclaves of Palestinian cities and towns, often surrounded entirely by walls or militarized fences. And so they know what they're doing, right? They're very aware of what this is doing to the land and to the people, and they continue to do it. And the answer is profit. They are making money. People are making millions and millions, billions of dollars off of this oppression. And I think it's really important, and this is a lot of what we do with Adala Justice Project, where we work to de-exceptionalize Israel, that what Israel is doing is nothing new. We're seeing it playing out here in the US, as Asha was saying in Chicago. It's happened historically before Palestine, right? This is not the first instance of settler colonialism, as the US US is the biggest example of that. What's happening in Hawaii in the previous panel, I heard someone mentioned the Red Hill tanks, Puerto Rico, and the list is long. And so Israel is just, it's one block in that chain. And I think we really need to work to de-exceptionalize that, and that's part of the work that we're doing at Adana. Thank you.
Yeah, when I was thinking about your question, I was thinking about a statement or phrase that Audre Lorde had mentioned, and I'm probably butchering it, but it was like, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives. And I also thought about, some of the work that I do, organizing work around that intersects around various issues. Some of them I can't talk about, some of the work that I do. Some work that I do I can't talk about, so I'm gonna talk about that. And one of them is there's this collective of currently incarcerated people known as Jailhouse Lawyer Speakers. And you should follow them on Twitter, Instagram. They speak for themselves, basically. And I've been engaged with some work with them for several years now. And in 2018, some people might remember that Jailhouse Lawyers Speak. They organized probably one of the largest nationwide strikes in the country. And they basically organized people from different states incarcerated in prison across states, a lot of states in the South. And they came together with this platform, and it's with 10 demands. And those 10 demands are basically it intersects in a lot of ways. So in I believe it was in 2020, last year, they called on people across the country to do strikes at prisons, jails, and ICE detention centers. So I organized with some folks in New York City to do an action at what's called the Boat, or the Vernon C. Bain Center, the barge. So New York, basically, New York City has probably the only jail boat in the country. It's called the barge, and it's adjacent to the Bronx. So we did an act, so I had to reach out. So I'm looking at the platform. On the platform, you have 10 demands. One of them used to be the restoration of Pell Grants for incarcerated students, but in December 2020, thanks to advocates and directly impacted people and allies, Congress basically restored Pell Grants for incarcerated students. So that was a good thing. Actually, this week, TAP, Tuition Assistance Program, was restored after 20-something years in New York. So, thanks to the advocates and the allies who worked on that. So because that was restored for Pell, was restored for incarcerated students, they did away with that demand and they replaced it with the immediate release of all political prisoners. So basically I had to reach out to different organizations that basically was actually engaged in the work for each of the demands. And one of the organizations that I reached out to was the Northeast Political Prisoner Coalition, NEPPC. And this was basically co-founded by the elder Sekou Odinga and others. So Sekou Odinga, former political prisoner, veteran BLA, he did the time already, so I can say it. He basically did the time for being the architect of getting Assata Shakur free. And so I reached out to that formation to get, to have a representative speak about this issue about political prisoners. Because we have political prisoners, in this country, even though this country don't want to recognize it, but we have political prisoners in this country. So I reached out to different folks. That was one organization. Another issue on the platform, one of the 10 demands was the immediate improvement of conditions of confinement. So we have someone to speak on that. And as the last panel mentioned, that's important. You know, that's important in regards to, you know, the conditions of confinement that people are incarcerated in. And so organizing across issues, you know, we had people that spoke about political prisoners. I reached out to an organization called the Games Coalition. Here in New York, there's a coalition of people who work with this Games Coalition because the NYPD has this database where they put, if you could just be not even affiliated with a street formation. I don't really like to call it gangs, but a street formation. You don't even have to be affiliated, but if a few of your friends in the neighborhood, in the block, could get stopped and searched, and your ID could be taken by the police, and they put you in the system as being part of a gang. And even like people as young as 12 and 13 years old was like in this gang database system. So we had a representative to speak on that, because inside prisons, people who are not affiliated with the street formations, or they might be like affiliated with have a radical politics, like, you know, maybe like the Black Guerrilla family or something like that. Inside prison, they are labeled as gangs. Even at one time in the country, people who practice Islam, Muslims, was considered as a gang by the Department of Corrections. You know, so and different faith groups and ideological groups were considered gangs. So that's why that demand in regards to the oppression, ending the oppression of people who are affiliated with street formation was one of the demands on the set demand. So we have the Gangs Coalition speak about, you know, their work that they actually engage in New York City. So that platform basically is like people working on different issues, and we intersect on this platform by coming together to have an action at the vote. And there's like other work that I'm engaged in, like around the campaign to close Rikers and what's going to happen when Rikers is closed. So there was ideas about, okay, they could build Rikers Island as an extension of LaGuardia Airport. But people who are impacted by it is like, how does that benefit those people who've been suffering and still suffering, going through, you know, Torture Island for decades into today? So we collaborate with environmental justice groups, like NRDC and NOPE, the New York Lawyers Public Trust, and we said, you know what? Since Rikers is a toxic island, it's 90% built on landfill. How about we address some of the climate or environmental justice issues to change Rikers Island? So a campaign called Renewable Rikers was launched, which is basically in New York City, they have these things called peaker plants. So peaker plants, like, is mostly in communities of color, and when the city utilizes a certain amount of energy, these peaker plants kick in, like, so the city won't black out. But the problem is that these peaker plants exhume a lot of toxicities into the atmosphere. And they mostly in communities of color. A lot of communities would say that it's going to be temporary, but they've been there for decades. Actually, if you live in Queensbridge houses, which is the largest NYCHA housing in the country, you can see actually one of these peaker plants from the window. So the vision of Renewable Rikers is to make Rikers Island green, sustainable energy to power the city and remove these peaker plants out of these communities. So one, it would create, you know, green, sustainable energy. Two, it would create space for these communities to decide whatever they want with it, and that's another battle, because, you know, anytime there's space, there's going to be a fight for it. So we have to organize those communities impacted by that. And three, you know, moving towards, like, you know, green energies, you know, and green jobs, etc. But before we get there, we got to get Rikers shut down. So I'll end it with that.
Such powerful work, and you see like the connections being made. Like, once you start seeing how all of these struggles are linked, you're like, we're going to start making our demands differently. because we're not going to just ask for what is practical, what the state will concede to, and be like, sure, we'll give you a toxic airport instead. You ask for what is necessary, for what is life-giving, for what is just for all of us, and for this entire community that is struggling for justice, and we refuse to let some people go. And that's what I think this kind of praxis, the actual practice of solidarity requires of us, which is like, it's all of us. And I think that happened in the last panel too. And when you start thinking that way, suddenly your demands become clearer. And so I'm interested in going a little bit further into your own work and just like how this kind of cross-movement building has shifted the way that you struggle. So it's, as you're working across issues to build power or to disrupt narratives around violence, disrupt narratives around supremacy, I think you said Sumaya, like, how does it shift, right? So thinking about some of the lessons learned or principles about this work. So as you're building across movements, what changes in your work? And then we're gonna get into some examples, but I'm interested in like that orientation. What does it demand of you as an organizer? Asha, go ahead.
So I started organizing as a student in a group called Students Against Mass Incarceration, which is where I learned about prison abolition. And not long after that, I was a part of starting something called BYP 100, in which we talk about as a Black queer feminist lens. And those two kind of pillars were what, guided my political development. And I think to speak a little bit to Black queer feminism and what we understood that to be in BYP 100, drawing on, the legacy of the Combahee River Collective, the legacy of Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, and many other, iterations of, I think, Black feminists in particular leading the way in really different frameworks for that, for understanding that Audre Lorde quote that you mentioned, right? We can't understand issues as single because we are not single. And so Black queer feminism offered to me as a kind of guide of, yes, in this organization, we are primarily centering Blackness, we're young Black people fighting for our liberation. And that's not the only axis that we need to consider when we're talking about people's relationship to power. So we should be talking about queerness, gender, and sexuality, and how that impacts how people are able to move and experience, the oppression of different systems that we live under. We have to be incorporating an analysis of class. We have to be internationalist. We can't just be talking about whoever is in the room at this moment, or whoever is at the center of that room, or whoever is impacted by a particular system in one way. But when we bring in folks who are experiencing marginalization, whether it's in terms of citizenship status or gender or race or class or whatever else, then we have to understand how the systems are working together too, because that is what is being reflected in the experiences of folks that live at intersections. And I think coming to Dissenters, a relatively new-ish organization, about 2 years old. I came in a little over a year and a half ago, really finding a space where the Black organizing work that I had been doing against policing in particular was affirmed as also anti-imperialist, anti-militarist work that we can see as in connection to a global struggle, and how so many different peoples are experiencing similar forms of violence, and living particular realities and in particular contexts of that violence, but for the same purpose of kind of maintaining these social, political, economic hierarchies in society that lay the groundwork for extraction, exploitation, and profit. And so I think, really seeing that as informed by, I think, the Panthers offered a framework for seeing policing in Black communities as an occupying force and framing it as anti-imperialist in that way. But that's just been a little bit of my experience and my journey of my political development, and also, how I've found home in the organization that I'm in.
It's a great question, and I feel like there's so many different ways to go with it. I think for Palestine work specifically in the US, there's no way to organize around Palestine, whether it's in the US or in Palestine, without connecting it to other struggles, that the struggle will not move forward in any other way, just like any other struggle. But I think particularly with Palestine, because Israel's entire project relies on isolating Palestinians, on isolating who Palestinians are and what they're going through, and instead painting Israel's settler colonial project itself as a project of liberation. So sort of like flipping the narrative. And the only way to undo that is to connect Palestine to so many other things, and do it in a way that's uncompromising and unapologetic. And that's what we're trying to do in the US. I think that's what the Palestine movement is trying to do. It has been quite successful, I would say. And not just recently, but for decades, from 1948, when Israel established itself as a state, is building across borders, building with the other struggles that took place throughout the second half of the 20th century, whether it was, the anti-war movement in Vietnam, the Black Panthers here in the US, the incredible, I think one of the most inspiring things that I turn to at times where I'm like, this is really hard, and we can't, the connections people aren't getting the connections, is the poetry of June Jordan, when she writes about Palestine and Black liberation and how deeply the two are connected, and what it means to push back against the propaganda, against the narratives that isolate Palestinians. And I also think about how the response from the US government, from Israel, from others, when we do connect the struggles, is so violent and so intense and so disproportionate. The smallest connection we make between two struggles is met with millions and millions of dollars in funding against us, right? When students, like Students for Justice in Palestine, which is where I got involved in organizing around Palestine here in the US, when SJPs on college campuses start talking about a divestment campaign, start holding Palestine 101 conversations, start working with different, Black student unions on campus, or Prison Divest on campus. Columbia is actually a good example of that, SJP at Columbia and Prison Divest at Columbia. The reaction is so disproportionate, the way that they clamp down on this. And it's because, as Nadia said at the beginning, when we connect our struggles, it really does make empires tremble, because they know that it works, because we recognize how much power we have, how much influence we have in their profit-making machine, and how we're able to show just regular people that this actually has an impact on your life, right? Palestine is not this faraway thing that has nothing to do with our lives here in New York City. When I was coming here today, I got off at the bus stop right here and I was walking. It was, I had stopped raining, so it was kind of a beautiful day. And then suddenly there was some military plane overhead. It was so loud and so jarring in this otherwise, pretty Riverside Park situation. And it's like, this is everywhere. It's hidden in plain sight, right? What the US military is doing, what Israel is doing, how policing is completely destroying our communities. It's all in plain sight. And simultaneously, it's weirdly hidden and woven into the fabric of society in a way that's supposed to make us feel like this is how it's supposed to be. Not that actually this is by design and it can change, because it hasn't always been this way. And I think the Red Hill tanks in Hawaii are just another really good example of this, where you have these 4 giant fuel tanks just in the mountain, in this mountain that looks so beautiful on the outside, And inside are these tanks just leaking fuel, poisoning hundreds of thousands of people. The other thing I wanted to say about this too is that I think one of the really powerful things about this, cross-movement collective liberation is that it asserts that none of these struggles are humanitarian struggles, they're political struggles, and that we refuse to allow them to be framed as humanitarian struggles, as, just donate to charity and this will be fine. You care about Gaza and what's happening there, great, donate to Gaza's children. No, that's not what we want. That's not what liberation is. This is a political struggle. We need to take political stances and sort of pushing away all of the liberal language around not just reform and charity and humanitarianism, but around this idea that we don't have to have a political stance, right? So often in our work, and this was both on campus as a student and after, the same excuse of, we don't do politics, when in fact, everything these people are steeped in is political, right? Every decision you make or don't make, the silence is political. And its impact is not symbolic, its impact is material on people's lives, not just here, but everywhere. And I think the pandemic has really brought that to light in the last few years in particular.
Yeah, I don't have really, they laid it out. I don't really have nothing to add, to what they said because they basically laid it out. I'll probably just share just a little bit about how my organizing, not much of my organizing has shifted. It kind of like expanded, and like as you mentioned, like it expanded in regards to like the environmental justice work, but a lot of what I'm learning is expanding even more, and that's why, as was mentioned, we have to make those connections internationally. Because if we get a win here in New York City around any organizing work we do, the people who oppose that work in other states, even here, but in other states, they're going to be looking and say, we don't want that to happen here, and they're going to be organizing against that. Likewise, if we get a victory here on the settler colonial project called the U.S., don't you think the allies across the world are going to be like, we need to stop that? Yeah. They're going to come and support the allies that's getting crushed over here. So that's why, if we look at the struggles of the past, like the Black Panther Party, they had an international lens. They connected the struggles, like I said. So we got to look at the press groups all across the world. What are they doing? Identify with that struggle. And so one of the media outlets that I listen to on YouTube is called Black Power Media. So in Black Power Media, they have like different segments, and one of the segments that they have, Jackie Luqman, she's a host of a program on there, and she's part of an organization called Black Alliance for Peace. And Black Alliance for Peace, they have an international, lens. Actually, I was watching yesterday, and the host, Jackie Luqman, she's actually going to Venezuela to some conference as a representative of Black Alliance for Peace. So basically what I said, we have to have an international lens. We have to connect the struggles all across the world, and we have to, that's the only way we're really going to get, freedom and liberation. The people in the past who came before us, they did it, they got it right. How do you think Assata got free to where she had in Cuba? Because it was a relationship built. And there's people political exiles, in other countries as well. And they protect that, and they adhere to that. To this day, decades since the struggles in the 60s and the 70s. So that's one of the benefits. Because if we have an ally that's powerful in another country, has resources, they can resource our movements here. They can resource our movements here. So yeah, with that.
I hope you're taking down some of these lessons, right? So, Sumaya, you say the point is to keep us apart. So you have to challenge isolation. We have to challenge isolation because the point is to keep us apart. And Asha, you said, you know, when you connect these struggles, you get so close to the why. You understand the why. That there's interest in the status quo. There's investment, there's profit. We got to get to the why and then require a recalibration of priorities. Divest from this, invest in community, right? That ask the why. Darren, you're talking about big and bold visions, international visions. Be as big and as bold as we need to thrive. And then I'm loving this idea that these are political decisions, right? This is a political decision. And we have to learn from each other. The oppressors are learning from each other, which is what Sumaya said. They're exchanging strategies, surveillance technologies. We know how to oppress people, control people, segregate people. Let's exchange that. We know how to extract and exploit. So the oppressors are learning from each other, and we need to learn from each other too, from history, from each other's struggles. And so we're going to get into that. But I'm going to ask a question because we're going to turn it over to an artist on the screen, which is who are there artists in the room, creatives? Raising your hands. Are there people in the room who can believe that the world can be radically different than it is today? You are artists. You are artists. On this panel, there are organizers, and it requires us to be artists, to imagine something completely different, to unlock our imaginations, to say we don't need the P's. This is Alice Walker, I believe it's Alice Walker, who talked about the kind of 4 P's that we have to uproot in our society, and we're going to add to that, but she said prison, patriarchy, poverty, Palestine. We talked about pollution and pesticides on the first panel, right? We have to think about these kind of broad changes that we need to see in the world. What are we going to uproot? And then the artist will tell us what are we going to build in its place. So I'm going to ask Monica Trinidad, who recorded something, to share a little bit about the role of artists in cross-movement building, in telling stories where we see each other in those stories. And crucially, I think it's the shift from the lenses that you're talking about, Asha, Black queer feminism, abolition as a lens, and also how art makes those lenses mirrors, or where you start like having to look at yourself. What does Black queer feminism require of me? What does abolition require of me? What do I have to uproot in myself? And I think art lets us get there. So we're going to play Monica answering that question.
Hi everyone, my name is Monica Trinidad. I use she or they pronouns, and I'm calling from Chicago. Sorry I can't be there with you all. I hope the sun is not too bright, which isn't a bad thing, right? So the role of the artist in our movement is not a small one, right? It's an essential one. Art helps us to not only envision a world that we're fighting for and building for, but to feel it as well. So just as like our organization or campaign might have a theory of change or a communication strategy, we also have to have a visual strategy and a cultural strategy to effectively communicate our message to the public, and then also to like draw more people into them, right? The visuals that we put out there are often how the public first sees and interacts with our work, so it's incredibly memorable. I mean, think about a campaign that you've supported or you've showed up to, not organized, right? Just like showed up. Do you remember the toolkit that they gave you and what it said, or do you remember the graphics or the visuals that they provided to you, to share online? Or do you remember, the messaging docs or like the messaging that they gave you, right? Or do you remember the t-shirts or the buttons that they passed out at the rally or, the event that you were at? And then also think about like the photos that get taken at the rally or the protests, and then they're like shared out in media. If you don't have visuals, are people gonna really quickly grasp what your message is and what you're fighting for? So that's something that I always think about, like around just like the very foundation of why a visual strategy and a cultural strategy are super important. People who know me and who organize with me know that I always say that the process of making movement art is just as important as the art that's created, if not more so. But I also think it depends on whether your priority is, producing stunning visuals or utilizing art making to build relationships and community power. But I think both can and should be prioritized. Another way to think about what I'm saying is that a cultural strategy is just as important as a visual strategy. A cultural strategy brings in artists, storytellers, medium makers, and cultural influencers into your movement building work as agents of social change, so that artists can activate community members as catalysts for social change, through their art and cultural work. But a strong cultural strategy really requires a collaborative process, which means involving artists from day one in your organizing strategy as a very critical component. And a strong visual strategy can come out of this collaborative process. When we as artists show up in movements with both, our creative knowledge and curiosity, we cultivate connection and we build deeper openings in our movements that draw more people in. And Nadia, you asked in your question, what is our obligation to tell the stories that are not only lenses, but mirrors? And what I always think about is how critical movement art is for documenting our struggles and wins. I think about the Celebrate People's History poster series that's been curated by Justine and Josh McPhee. I think of posters by Ricardo Levens Morales. I think of Michael Bazan, Emery Fabiana Rodriguez. I think of all of these movements essentially creating this archival documentation of our movements, our struggles and our wins throughout history. And it's because art can offer context for our people to lean on in future movement work. And it can also be an inspiration for those of us who are organizing every single day, who actively have to build up these muscles of hope for the long haul of this work. We need to not only provide our communities with visual stories of power in a world where many feel so powerless, but for ourselves as well. We don't get a lot of wins. So when we do, we really have to lift those wins up. And art activates people, and it can move us from hundreds of isolated stories to hundreds of connected ones. I'll forever have to lift up the No Cop Academy campaign, not because I was part of it, but because it was such a brilliant example of what a campaign can accomplish when you involve artists and cultural workers from day one. And since I'm still meeting and talking to people who haven't heard of this former campaign, I'll just quickly say that it was a youth-led, intergenerational, and intersectional campaign to stop the proposed construction of a $95 million police academy on Chicago's west side. And artists were involved from day one in that organizing strategy. So instinctively, we launched this campaign with a citywide call for poster art. And the prompt to artists was simple. How would you spend $95 million in your neighborhood? And through doing that, we carved out space for a larger dialogue to take shape and a way for directly impacted people to share their community's needs, and in turn then a pathway towards reimagining collectively a better city and a better world. And that highlighted the need for mental health care, community gardens, after school programs, and so much more than a new police academy, right, that could offer us. And through this process, then we invited communities to an exhibition of these posters. And then we used that space to share information about the campaign and how they can get involved. We continuously hosted art builds throughout the campaign. We invited community members to screen print and buttons and posters and banners, and we made it fun. Our movements need to be fun if we want people to join them, right? And it's not surprising that by the end of this campaign, which lasted a couple of years, we had over 100 organizations who endorsed this campaign across the city, across the country. We had educators, artists, movement lawyers, environmental justice organizers, socialists, anti-war organizers. We had so many different issue-based organizations because they were able to visually see and understand that $95 million could absolutely be better spent on resources that our communities needed and deserved. And I'm not saying that art and visual, like a visual strategy, was the sole reason that produced these results, because it wasn't, but it played a role, right? Art is a tool that's part of our organizing strategy, right? And it helps us not only break down, the walls and the barriers in our communities and expose, the rot underneath, but it also allows us to build up and shape, a better world and a better future that we're all trying to create collectively. And when we organize with a cultural strategy and when we create artwork in very collaborative methods, right, by including and involving artists in day one in your organizing strategy, we create space for all of our fullest selves to be seen, to be heard, and that is what our movements are doing, right? We want everybody to be seen and heard and cared for. And we're also able to ground ourselves collectively in our values, our principles, and in our visions for a better world. So all of that to say is that art can spark something for people to tangibly connect their story to someone else's. And that is so powerful. And it can change how people perceive themselves and their role in the world. And we need it to keep dreaming up bigger visions for the world that we're building. Thank you.
Like that. Art as connection. It's another value, right? And so this last question before we open it up, and if folks have questions, we'll have 20 minutes or so for your questions. But it is just building on those lessons for us, right? So if you can think of a particular example in your work of cross-movement building and draw out those principles and strategies. And those can be lessons learned, great lessons, always do this, or totally avoid this is a big disaster. Well, here's a challenge that we had that we need to overcome, right? So add to this list for us. So what, if you take an example, and Darren, maybe we'll start with you and come back. Take an example in your work, and you spoke about Rikers, but there's a ton for you too of cross-movement building, and then a principle that you want us to take with us, or a strategy that you're like, this works or this doesn't work.
Yeah, so what works or what doesn't work? Well, I think what doesn't work is doing organizing and not centering in people that's impacted by the issue in the work, because if you organize in people and you don't center those who directly impacted by the issue, where's the accountability? You could just, whatever you want and not be held accountable, for what you're doing. So I think as a principle, any work that we engage in, any organizing that we do, we definitely have to, center and amplify, the people who are directly impacted by the issue. And as organizers, we supposed to, there's a saying, we have to organize ourselves out of the job, out of the work. So you organize so effectively that the people you organize, they could manage the whole campaign on their own. That's a good organizer. That's a good organizer. So I leave that.
I'm gonna give an example of a specific campaign that's actually ongoing right now that Data Justice Project is involved in. So there's this environmental institution called Sierra Club. I don't know how many people have heard of it. I only heard of it for the first time in January. Started to learn about how awful it has been historically and kind of still today. And Sierra Club, like many other organizations in the US, have these trips to Israel. And for Sierra Club specifically, they're nature trips, or that's how they're advertised. Nature trips to Israel where you can walk around, look at birds, look at trees, all the while ignoring and actively normalizing what Israel is doing to Palestinians. And of course, these trips are framed as apolitical. It's just nature trips. Why do we have to bring politics into it? And so a coalition of groups, including Data Justice Project, Movement for Black Lives, Indian Collective, US Campaign, other groups, it was very cross-movement coalition, came together and sent Sierra Club a letter saying you need to cancel these trips. These are not just nature trips, these are actively normalizing apartheid. And Sierra Club had been going through this internal reckoning. It has an incredibly racist past. Its founder was a white supremacist, and had been going through this internal reckoning around, how do we become an anti-racist organization? How do we take more seriously our connections to indigenous struggles in the US, on Turtle Island, in Hawaii? And they had been doing, somewhat of a good job on that. Like a lot of their programs are around indigenous liberation on Turtle Island. But when it came to Palestine, and including Palestine and that narrative of indigenous liberation, they paused, and they didn't want to budge. Eventually, we got them to budge, and they actually canceled the 2 trips that were slated to happen in March. And that was an incredible victory, and it was precisely because of this coalition, this cross-movement coalition, right, that Movement for Black Lives was saying, you can't say you're anti-racist and then choose not to include Palestine in that framework of anti-racism. Indian Collective was saying you can't say you stand with indigenous peoples on Turtle Island, but not think about Palestinians as indigenous people fighting a settler colonial state. We refuse that. We refuse that framing. We don't accept your solidarity with us if it doesn't extend, if it has boundaries and qualifications. You're either actually for liberation, no exception, or you're not. There's no in between in this situation. After they canceled their trips, they got a lot of pressure from funders, as usual, right, profit, and they backtracked. And they said, okay, no, we are gonna have a trip to Israel. It's gonna be in the summer. They're planning it right now, so our campaign is ongoing. And the language they used is one that I'm sure we're all familiar with and that we've all talked about today, which is that we don't take political stances. We made a mistake canceling these trips. We don't take political stances. This is just a nature trip. And they kind of doubled down on that, completely ignoring what we were saying about what was happening in Palestine. And so the campaign is ongoing, but I think one of the really powerful things that we learned from that was one, the real influence of cross-movement building and being uncompromising, even when we don't think we're gonna win. Like, we didn't think they were gonna cancel those 2 trips, we really didn't. But all of the organizations in the coalition were like, it doesn't matter, the point is to put that pressure on, to make it clear that they can't continue their work with Movement for Black Lives, with Indian Collective, without realizing that they're gonna have to cancel these trips to do so, that they're gonna have to be pushed on this. And what just came out last week, this new article came out about how different states are actually using as a template. Basically, there's, as we all know, there's a clampdown on climate activists in the US, and specifically after what happened at Standing Rock. And a lot of the laws that are coming down against fossil fuel divestment, against attempts to boycott fossil fuel companies, there are anti-boycott laws being introduced in different state legislatures across the country. And the news that came out last week is that the templates for these anti-boycott laws are taken directly from the laws that have been used to target anti-Israel boycotts, so the laws that were targeting Palestinians. And New York State in particular is infamous for this because there's an anti-Israel boycott blacklist, where if you engage in boycotts of Israel, you're on a blacklist. The state won't give you certain types of funding, won't work with you. This was all thanks to Cuomo, but of course nothing has changed with the new governor, and instead they're just, dumping money into other things, meanwhile clamping down on this type of activism. But the reason I mention this is that one of the reasons the Sierra Club campaign is so important is it shows that you can't separate climate justice from imperialism, right? That this has to be part of our framework, because look at how these laws targeting Palestinians are now targeting climate activists. And we know it won't stop there, that they're gonna continue to expand that. They're gonna come for all the different types of organizers and movement builders that are actively working against this profit-making machine.
The ops are international too.
So there's like an approach to organizing that I've heard that encourages us to like look at the big problems in the world and then like cut our issue, get really specific, figure out what's winnable and stick to that. You know, there's some value in specificity and figuring out good demands that we can win and a strategy and like staying on track, for sure. And I think that it's important to balance that, right, with the principle of solidarity and really making sure that we are embracing organizing strategies that bring more of us together. Because I think that there's a pitfall in that type of approach that can lead us to only fighting for incremental changes or only a win that's going to impact this one specific set of people or make an impact for this short-term period of time. And we might get some wins out of those types of organizing strategies, but I don't think that we'll transform systems thinking only that way, and I don't think we'll get free. And so because this is beyond the bars and we're like in West Harlem, I feel like I have to talk about, you know, my time at Columbia a little bit and criticize the institution. So in 2014, I was a student organizer. We were organizing around prison divestment at Columbia. I was also a part of BYP 100. We were organizing around police violence in New York City and around the country. And, you know, some of the advice that we got as prison divest organizers was like, stick to prisons. One of the companies that we were targeting Columbia divesting from was G4S, which at the time maybe still is the largest multinational security company in the world, operates checkpoints and prisons in occupied Palestine. And we were told, like, focus on prisons, stop talking about Palestine, you just might win, but if you keep talking about Palestine, you probably won't. And, you know, we rejected that advice. We built, you know, deep, strong coalition with the Students for Justice in Palestine chapter. We're in the University Senate with, you know, signs that were like maybe about to lose us the like deciding vote on our campaign, but there were a lot more of us. And anyway, so in 2014, the NYPD conducted what was, you know, labeled as the largest gang raid in NYPD history on the Grant and Manhattanville houses just up the street. And this was over the summer, and as students, we got a university-wide email congratulating the NYPD and thanking them for making our community safer in the name of the safety of students. And me and my friends were like, what the, whatever. And, you know, I think one approach in that moment could have been to kind of notice this, but say, we're gonna stick to our lane, we're running this divestment campaign, we're focused on like the university and its investments, or even the university, only just the university's role in policing and in this raid that, you know, over 100 young Black and brown men were locked up in this raid. We see that as a part of Columbia's agenda, collaborating with NYPD to criminalize, you know, this neighborhood in paving way for its ongoing expansion. Another imperialist project we could talk about. And I think it was a very powerful experience for me to meet an incredible organizer named Taylor Murphy, who was instrumental in bringing us as students, bringing community members who lived in Grant and Manhattanville houses, folks who were the parents of the young men who were locked up, and parents of, like him, people who were victims to community violence, and saying there is a very strong, well-funded NYPD and Columbia media and narrative campaign that's very strategically trying to divide us. For students to feel like this is a thing that's keeping us safe, for folks who are combating community violence to be in collaboration with the police, and for folks who are, you know, doing anti-criminalization work and resisting that in their own lives and in their separate corner. But instead, there were, you know, a number of coalition organizing meetings. I just think, you know, really, really deep solidarity meetings, conversations, where people were like, I believe this narrative that we had separate interests, and now we're in the room together, and I see that we don't. As students, right, experiencing racism by the Columbia University Police Department as well, we had a stake in this too. So I don't know, that's like one example. I think it's dope to be a part of Dissenters Now and see young people who are running Divest from Death campaigns, targeting weapons manufacturers that are profiting from war, in collaboration with students who are doing Cops off-campus work, and kind of continuing in that tradition of this, we are running maybe different campaigns with different targets, but we're together in this, and we're gonna learn from each other, and we're not gonna, fall into that trap of a kind of single issue organizing strategy, because there are so much more of us when we collaborate and when we come together, and our coalitions are so much bigger.
Thank you all so much. We are everything we need. We get it. Like, we also know what will win. And of course, that scares the powerful. And they try to divide, and they try to make it really, really complicated to see these connections, right? Or to force us into these spaces where we have to compromise or make choices or believe that you can only save yourself in this. We know what it takes to thrive. We know what we need, we know what we deserve. There's tons of lessons here, but I want, if there's a mic here to my left, if folks have a couple of questions, maybe we can take a couple of questions. I know you all are eating, saha, for those who are fasting, Ramadan Kareem. But if you have some questions, we're happy to take a few. And there's a mic here. I don't know if I see some folks.
Hi. This is actually a little bit less of a question, although I certainly welcome comments. I think it's important for people to understand that the question of Israel-Palestine and the question of policing is in fact intimately entwined. I'm not sure how many people know that our police are trained in Israel with the Palestinians as the people on whom they are trained, and that there is a move, and I'm not quite sure where New York is at this point, to not send our police to train in essentially military tactics, which we saw in the Black Lives Matter movement, what the police were using, and that our government, up until recently, by distributing weapons, excess military weapons to police force, are militarizing that, so that you have this combination of the Israel-Palestine question and the techniques that are being used in Israel and or by Israelis on the West Bank and Gaza, that they are transferring these techniques to use in poor communities in this country.
Yeah, this is one of the lessons learned, right? That our oppressors are learning from each other. And so that there is so much that we can do in terms of learning from those of us who are struggling for justice. If there are not any other questions, I'm happy to give you a last word, each of you, if you want to just share one more thing to the group of us who are here to build, like ready to organize, ready to build, that we want to see, that we can't yet see, or the artists allow us to see. There's one more thing that you might want to leave us with before we close. I would love to hear from you.
Yeah, I was thinking about what Monica Trinidad was saying in her video about the importance of art. It's very, very, very important. If we think about, like, I love to go to actions and do chants. And some people might not know this, but the Black Panther Party, they had a music group called the Lumpin'. And I just got the book recently about the history of that. And they had songs, I think, like Free Bobby and other songs as well. And music, like I'm a big hip hop fan. I grew up on hip hop. I still love hip hop. And music has influenced the youth. Like one of the artists, Tupac Shakur, he comes from a movement family. His mother, Afina Shakur, who passed away, she was part of the Panther 21, and his stepfather, Latuba Shakur, who's a political prisoner, incarcerated right now, and people actually should like go online and look up Latuba Shakur and sign a petition because he's actually going to be up for parole soon. So Tupac, he was like kind of like how Malcolm was. Malcolm X grew up in a house where his father was a Garveyite, but stuff from his family, from his father, from his parents, about Africa, about being conscious stuff. But he got to the streets, he became Detroit bred. But when he got incarcerated, those seeds that was already in him from his parents, it was watered, so by the Nation of Islam and became Malcolm X. So I'm saying that because like Tupac, he came from a movement family, and I believe that he was coming around. Some of his music that I listened to today, you could hear like every album that he always had some conscious raising lyrics in his music. And it was mixed, it was mixed. It had some other problematic stuff too, some of a lot of his music. But because he had those seeds implanted in him, the people who probably wouldn't listen to him when he talk about revolution and stuff like that will listen to his other music, and then they'll probably come across those conscious lyrics, and that will plant a seed. So art is very important. Music is a part of art. There was like the chants that used to happen. Like today, like some chants, I don't really like those civil rights chants that people be doing because I'm trying to move away from that. But it was like chants. If we look across movement, like chants today have an impact. People who create and develop chants, it has an impact. Like it was a time it was chants like in the party, the Black Panther Party, they had chants like time to pick up the gun off the pig. The revolution has come off the pig. Today it's like hands up, don't shoot. So like chants is part of art, music is part of art, and we have to contend with some music and chants that's not in line, with our politics. So to the artists out there, we need some conscious music.
Two things come to mind. I'm going to try to be very brief for the sake of time. The first is I think very often, and especially right now, with what's happening in Palestine right now, things are just getting worse and worse, even though I think the movement for Palestine in the US is growing stronger and stronger, and there's between those two things. Is I often find myself just reminding myself that it can feel like we can't win, that it's all too much, too big, too complicated. And I think back to actually when I was a student too, and at Columbia, when we started the BDS campaign at Columbia, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions campaign at Columbia, how the idea of winning that at a place like Columbia University seemed absolutely impossible. At a place where Zionists were organized and well-funded and had the backing of the administration and the city and the state. The idea that an SJP could win a divestment campaign seemed impossible, and still we pushed for it and we built for it and spent many hours, coupled with schoolwork and other things, fighting for it, and then graduated, and then new freshman class came in, and that one graduated too, and then they won it, and then they won the campaign a couple of years later. And when we started it, no one expected it to go that far that fast. And I think I remember when the news came out, it was such a shock and really emotional because you realize that things change quickly. The world is changing quickly, and we are winning slowly, and then sometimes some big things happen and we win big moments, and then things die down again, and then it comes back. And it's hard to predict, and it's hard to know, and so we fight as though that moment, that opportunity is just going to be tomorrow. And we hold on to that and sort of balancing this idea. And I think, Asha, you mentioned this really well, like I want to take your words exactly, that you have to balance this whole, like, what is realistic and possible, and what are we fighting for that seems impossible, but we know we can win. And that the people who have come before us, the generations that have come before us, has taught us that. And this links to the other thing I wanted to mention that I'm constantly sort of grappling with, which is the past and the struggles of the past and the organizers of the past, and specifically with Palestine. Like, there are so many incredible people to name. Hassan Kanafani is one of the first that comes to mind. But also how important it is not to romanticize the past and get stuck in the past and the strategies of the past. To study them and learn from them, from the people and the movements and the campaigns that brought us to where we are, without treating them as a blueprint for where we want to go. And I think it's really tough to do that. It can be easy to get sucked into romanticizing the past, but how important it is to look at our context now, with all that we've learned who've come before us, and then to think about what is our strategy for what comes next, what is our blueprint for what we want to build, and to be humble but also visionary and confident in that we're able to do that with what we have today, with who we are today, and where our movement is today.
So the theme of this year's conference, Movement Building in a World on Fire, reflecting on how I, as an organizer these days, talk to a lot of people who feel like it's the end of the world. Like impending climate climate catastrophe, the ongoing reality of war, just like policing getting so much worse, the just extreme repression and decimation of our movements when we do try to resist. And, that is real. That is a real way to feel in the times that we're in. And I think and I promise this will be hopeful. And I think the thing that is maybe not hopeful, but grounding for me is just to think about, zooming out historically, like the world has ended before, I think about, what would it have been like to experience, captivity in the context of chattel slavery, to experience settler colonialism, of the United States, just to experience colonization, to experience chattel slavery, to experience many things that have come before in the past. And that's not to say that everything will survive or that the pathway through will be great, but it does mean that there will be something after, that the world is constantly being remade, and it may be inevitable that it will change. It may be inevitable that some harmful things will continue to happen, but it's not inevitable how it will be in the future. Just a stake in that in such a serious way. And so, just to tell one more short snippet of a story, in May of last year, in 2021, was the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, and in Chicago, folks were organizing a defund, police rally to commemorate the life of George Floyd. The kind of slogan of it was "Mourn the dead, fight like hell for the living." In May of 2020 was also the moment where Israel was, escalating its assault, particularly on the community of Sheikh Jarrah. There were uprisings and, solidarity protests. All over the world, our dissenters members were involved in that, and building coalition with Students in Justice for Palestine. The State Department was trying to push through and approve a $735 million weapons deal by Boeing, and so we're calling attention to their presence in Chicago, and so there was a SJP-led rally against Boeing on that day. There was this defund thing, and then there'd also been this fight around the Columbus statue in Chicago that Indigenous young folks have been fighting around. And so, the single issue approach would have been like, there's a bunch of competing rallies, we're gonna focus on turnout for our own thing, whatever. Deeply segregated city, so it's not easy to know what's going on in different people's communities. But what happened was Black and Brown and Indigenous and Palestinian young folks and community members, came together, and there was a march that started with the defund the police stuff that went to the Columbus statue, which now it looks like is not going to be put back up in Chicago after it was, protested last summer, and then marched and joined the rally at Boeing with SJP. And now there's a win in that campaign where we're seeing that Boeing is not going to get that multi-million-dollar tax break from the city this year. And so I don't know. I think I find hope in moments like that we are finding each other more, that we are connecting our struggles, and there are some wins. We need a lot more people in our movements. We need to be a lot more organized. We are not as powerful as the people that we're up against. And maybe the world is ending, but we have a stake in what comes after, what comes next. And yeah, I think that there is deep power in some of the movement building and connecting in ways that folks are doing that, in ways that are not just the right thing to do, but are strategic and smart and necessary. And we just might win. We just might win. And as a combination, I hope you all are having lunch, but to Darren, who's asking us about chanting and music. Are folks familiar with this song? Nalini Stamp, an amazing organizer, artist, cultural worker, wrote a song called The People Will Rise. The People Will Rise. And love this song. It's a great chant. I'm going to teach it to you. But I want to build on the theme of the conference. And so after I heard this song, I wrote another verse, which is also kind of this visionary world, imagining where we're going. And I think the next panel is going to take us there. But it goes like this. So I'm going to speak it, and then you'll speak it, and then I'll sing it, and then you'll sing it back to me. So this is again on the tune of The People Will Rise by Nalini Stamp. Okay, so it goes, welcome to the revolution where your shit's burnt down. Welcome to the revolution where your shit's burnt down. There's syncopation. Welcome to the revolution where your shit's burnt down. Welcome to the revolution where your shit's burnt down. All you stole has now been recovered. What was lost is found. All you stole has now been recovered. What was lost is found. The people are fire. 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 Welcome to the revolution where your shit's burnt down. Again, welcome to the revolution where your shit's burnt down. Welcome to the revolution where your shit's burnt down. All you stole has now been recovered. What was lost is found. All you stole has now been recovered. What was lost is found. Again, all you stole has now been recovered. What was lost is found.
The people are fire, the people are fire, the people are fire. The people are fire, the people are fire, the people are fire. Okay, so welcome to the revolution where your shit's burnt down. All you stole has now been recovered. What was lost is found. The people are fire, the people are fire, the people are fire. Ready? Welcome to the, you can stand up, revolution where your shit's burned down. All you stole has now been recovered. What was lost is found. The people are fire, the people are fire, the people are fire. The people are fire, the people are fire, the people are fire. One more time. Welcome to the revolution where your shit's burnt down. All you stole has now been recovered. What was lost is found. The people are fire, the people are fire, the people are fire. The people are fire, the people are fire, the people are fire.
Thank you guys for that. Thank you. I was ready for the next round of the people of fire. I was coming in trying to do the dance. The people are fire, the people are fire, the people are fire. The people are fire, the people are fire. Y'all were ready? Hey, I thought it was that time. They were jamming, huh? Really quickly, everybody, lunch. Lunch is out in the lobby. We have a little over 30 minutes. We're going to start here again at 2:30. Just make up some time. Do not worry if you're not finished with your lunch. You can eat your lunch at your seat when we start the next panel. So get some lunch and enjoy. We'll see you in about 30 minutes. 2:30.